Right, until it's done. Right.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jessie Shula. We will get started here in a moment. Thank you. Hi, everyone. This is Jesse again. Just wanted to let you know we're having some technical issues inside of the PUC right now, but we are working to resolve those, and then we'll get started as soon as we're all here. Thank you for your patience.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you all see and hear me?
Yes, I can see and hear you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Well, I really apologize for the slight delay here. I did not have any functioning internet, so Ms. Chula was kind enough to help me out here. So apologize for the slight delay in us getting started. Good afternoon. My name is Megan Gilman, and today we are hosting a workshop as part of our work related to SB 22M-0171ALL implementation, which are equity initiatives at the Colorado PUC. Today's workshop will focus, or Commissioner Information Meeting, sorry, will focus on community engagement, and we have joining us several representatives from other PUCs to really help us understand some of the work that they've done. So I want to start first of all by thanking our speakers for joining us. Again, sorry for the brief delay in getting started here. I'm also joined by Chair Blank and Commissioner Plant as well. Would either of you like to say anything just as we get started?
No, just thanks for doing this, and looking forward to the conversation. So thanks.
Excellent. I did just want to, oh, sorry, Commissioner Plant, go ahead.
Oh, no, that's okay. I was just going to echo the chairman's comments, and really looking forward to hearing from all of our colleagues in these other states and learning from them. So appreciate you bringing everybody together.
Excellent. And full disclosure, Ms. Chula and Ms. Crandall did most of the work here. So many, many thanks to them as well for really getting us organized here and providing us with a really wonderful list of speakers to help advance our work in this area. So let's see, do I need to advance this slide? There we go. Excellent. So our speakers are joining us on Zoom. I do want to just let you all know the meeting is currently being streamed on the Commission's YouTube channel, and it'll be available for viewing afterwards. Only speakers, commissioners, and some support staff are in this meeting. We're going to aim for about a 10-minute break, close to 3:20, as close as we can get to that as we move forward. So next, I just wanted to give a little bit of context for equity at the Colorado PUC. I'll start with a brief overview of SB 21272. So SB 21272 passed by the Colorado legislature in 2021 was the impetus for much of the equity work that the commission's undertaking. The legislation directs the commission to promulgate rules requiring the commission and all of its work to consider how to best provide equity, to minimize impacts and prioritize benefits to disproportionately impacted communities and address historical inequities. This has sweeping implications for our entire team, as well possibly as some of the entities that we regulate. And it will impact everything from how we make decisions to how we get information out to the public to our internal agency goals. As a summary of the Commission's equity initiatives thus far, we're broadly working on implementing SB 22M-0171ALL along 3 work tracks that I wanted you to be aware of. The first is the agency's equity framework. This is an ongoing effort, including agency's guiding principles, in which we got stakeholder feedback on, and an assessment of how all of the teams are considering equity in their work. Next, we have some upcoming work related to rulemaking. Currently, we're in the pre-rulemaking phase of this, where we're gathering data through workshops and comment opportunities. Staff will issue a capstone report in June, which will summarize much of the feedback that they've received, as well as likely some recommendations as we move forward. Another ongoing effort is around our communications. This is a broad area of improvement and includes everything from improving our website to public participation opportunities and how we inform folks about the PUC and addresses our community engagement needs. Next, I want to set just a little bit of context for this meeting. We recognize that community engagement is an area where we need to continue to progress. There are several opportunities and challenges facing the Commission in regards to this area, which is why we're hosting this meeting. Some of our objectives and goals today are to learn about other regulatory and agency ecosystems for community engagement, including organizations conducting engagement, flows of information, and timing and venues for engagement. Next, we'd like to understand how agencies and commissions are assessing the effectiveness of community engagement, as well as learn what requirements, metrics, and provisions exist in other regulatory environments to ensure outreach is effectively elevating community needs. We're very excited to welcome our speakers who are working on equity across the country. We are joined by Rory Christensen, the Chair and CEO of the New York Public Service Commission, Berenice Garcia Tellez, a bilingual buildings equity administrator for the City and County of Denver, Tara Dornfeld, PhD, an analyst and public engagement specialist, and Angie McKinley, a diversity, equity, and inclusion coordinator for the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission. Grace Ralph, the Chief of Policy and Research at the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission. Karen McGowan, a commissioner at the Colorado Energy and Carbon Management Commission, as well as Michelle Scala, Energy Justice Program Manager at the Oregon Public Utilities Commission. So as we move forward, each speaker will present, and then the commissioners will have a chance to ask that speaker questions. Chair Christian is likely unable to join us for the main Q&A that we have at the end of the agenda. So after his presentation, if we'd like to ask any questions to him, that's probably the best opportunity to do so. Otherwise, we budgeted just a few minutes after each of the other speakers for any really pressing questions that you need to ask in that time frame. But we plan for most of the Q&A with most of the speakers to occur at the end of their presentation. And that would really just be Q&A from myself and the other commissioners, just to be clear. Just to reiterate, we'll plan to have around a 10-minute break around 3:20 or as close as we can get to that. And at the end, plan to have that 30-minute moderated panel discussion and Q&A with the commissioners. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Chair Christensen. Chair Christian, I'm so sorry. I keep giving you an extra syllable or two. I'm so sorry. Chair Rory Christian is from the New York PSC. He is the Chair and Chief Executive Officer of the New York Public Service Commission. Mr. Christian began his career in the energy industry with Keyspan Energy. He then transitioned to Exelon Energy, where he developed new products targeting public sector clientele and helped facilitate the creation of multiple partnerships and agencies. He then served as the Director of Energy Finance and Sustainability for the New York City Housing Authority, and more recently was the Director of the New York Clean Energy at Environmental Defense Fund, where he provided strategy management, programming, business development, and stakeholder collaboration for the Clean Energy Program in New York. He currently teaches energy efficiency courses at Columbia University School of Professional Studies, volunteers time with workforce development organizations as a longtime supporter and former chair of We Act for Environmental Justice Board of Directors. So Chair Christian, wonderful to have you. And if you want to turn your camera on and share a presentation with us, we're very appreciative of you being here.
Great. Thank you, Megan. Pleasure to see you. And just for logistics, you want me to share the presentation from my screen?
We have it here. If you prefer to share it, you can, but otherwise we can share it here.
Well, why don't you guys share it and I'll go through on my end. I'll tell you when to move ahead.
Okay,
Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. Name is Rory Christian. I'm the chair of the Public Service Commission and the CEO of the Department of Public Service. Here to share with you some efforts currently underway in New York on the subject of equity and particularly outreach to various interveners and how that works in terms of commission actions. Over the last few years, we've seen a significant change in both the nature of engagement and number of engagement from third parties becoming involved in PSC activities. And we see this as a result of many different factors, everything from increased awareness of climate change and the various risks. That's both more frequent storms and weather events and more severe events. We're also seeing those effects disproportionately impact individuals of color and low-income communities. And a lesson that we in New York have acutely learned post-Hurricane Sandy is that the support mechanisms in place as a result of many of these climate events often are not aligned with supporting individuals of color, low-income individuals, and diverse communities. So what we are trying to do is create an environment where we can effectively have engagement and encourage engagement from a wide array of individuals towards the various actions we seek to achieve. And much of this is being driven not just in part by what we're seeing from our stakeholders, but it's also being driven by state law. We recently passed the Climate Act, the CLC. Oh, you can stay there. I'm building up. Thank you. We recently passed the Climate Act, which sets not just renewable energy targets for the state, but also greenhouse gas emission targets. And it also requires that no less than 35% of climate action benefits go to what are described in New York State as disadvantaged communities. So we're working with a variety of individuals, not just to define what will consist of a disadvantaged community, but also what the challenges and barriers are in providing the benefits to those communities over time. So before I dive in, I want to take a few minutes to just talk about what kind of engagement we've had over time, and that'll lead us into where we are today and a few next steps that we're pursuing. Next slide, please. So intervener participation in the early 90s, early 2000s was largely focused in the form of rate cases. We deregulated our energy system around that time, divesting the T&D systems, separating the vertical utilities, vertically integrated utilities, having them become largely T&D utilities with ownership of generation owned by third parties. So much of that was highly technical, a lot of economic theory, a lot of market discussions. And again, the core of our mission to provide safe, reliable service was the primary goal of those engagements. But many of the individuals and entities engaging throughout that time were many of the same entities who had long since focused on the creation, establishment, and continued maintenance of the system. So there was a limited need to expand advocacy as those engaging were the usual suspects that would always engage. Next slide. And that focus on cost containment changed over time. I mentioned the increasingly severe weather events, public awareness of the impact of those events, and that over time has drawn more and more interest and focus. And we've seen a significant amount of environmental advocacy and participation through our commission activities. And to put it in context, a typical rate case in the early 2000s would have 5, maybe 600 public comments. Today, we have roughly several thousand comments in any given rate case. And that's just one of the many indicators of public interest and engagement in our various proceedings. And so what we have seen a lot of engagement in is our ability to move forward with many of the things that are ascribed to the clean energy agenda. We're looking at what to do with respect to natural gas. We have a number of participants who are taking very strong positions that no investments in natural gas need to be made, whether they be for the replacement of leak-prone pipe or for the normal maintenance and continuation of the system as it is. We have many parties who are looking to explore opportunities for distributed energy resources. And through that, we've created community choice aggregation programs. We've moved from a net energy metering economic regime towards a value-based regime for compensation that looks at the time, location, and type of generation rather than simply netting on your bill whatever generation is produced on site. So we've made some very significant policy changes over the last few years, and those are all largely focused on encouraging greater development of distributed energy resources, cleaner energy resources, and integrating energy efficiency more closely into various actions taken by individuals. Next slide. Today, and again, I mentioned the CLCPA earlier, the focus on efficiency, renewable energy, and distributed energy resources continues. And the pressures there are significant. In addition to continuing all the investments required to meet the various climate and reliability goals we have for ourselves, we are also faced with a significant change in economic conditions brought on as a result of the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, supply chain disruptions, and a variety of other factors. And this is all happening at a time where we're looking to make some very significant investments in not just building up the system, the electric system in particular, but expanding it and increasing our use and demands on it. So all of these conflicts are coming ahead and they're influencing both the cost individual ratepayers have to pay on their bills and our ability to make the investments. And so we have to find a way to balance all of these things, both the investments we need to make, the financial impacts on the individuals who will ultimately be paying the bills, and much of the advocacy that we're seeing are looking for ways to advance both of those goals, which are unfortunately sometimes at odds with one another. Next slide, please. So one of the key things we have found in the commission in helping to move forward with the dialogue and engaging various stakeholders is to ensure that the needed information for engagement is abundantly clear and available. Many years ago, we established our current document matter management system. This is a repository of information, all documentation submitted to the commission and developed by the commission will end up in this DMM system. And it is a centralized location where any information you seek to find can be found. And this is something we're constantly updating, and we're looking to evolve over time to increase and enhance its capabilities, make it more user-friendly. But I think this was probably one of the most significant actions taken by the commission in recent memory in making information more accessible. And as of today, all information since 1970 has been digitized and is available through the DMM system. So individuals doing research, wanting to understand what happened in the past, that information is readily available. And we're looking into initiatives to digitize information going back even further. We also regularly look to update our website with information. One particular aspect of that I'll share more details on at the end, but we want to ensure that all filings, all services are available and readily accessible on our website, particularly for customer complaints. We want to ensure that anyone who has an issue, be it with a utility or an ESCO or some other provider, can come to our site, find the information they need to take action, solicit our support as needed, and feel empowered through there. And again, we regularly look through our DMM system. It's constantly under review and it's updated regularly. At the end of every session, we put in all the various documents that are approved and reviewed. And if it's not updated every day, I'd say it's updated at least once a week. And we have a system in place where those updates aren't simply updated on the system. You have to check. Individuals can register for particular dockets that are of interest, particular actions that are of interest, receive email updates on those dockets as those updates arrive. So they're always up to speed and aware of what's going on if they've taken that initial step of registering. And so this is one of probably the more important parts of what we're doing, because again, ensuring that people are aware of the information that's available, aware of the various proceedings and protocols that we have, is a really important aspect of allowing for equitable engagement. And we at the New York State Commission, and I believe commissions in general, have an important role to play in ensuring that we can level the playing field and grant equal opportunities to all who wish to engage. One of the ways I think we can do that, again, providing written guidance, providing that information where it's easily accessible and readily available, and educating to the degree possible the various stakeholders on procedures and practices and various activities of the commission. That is an important first step and something that we at the PSC are working to improve upon daily. Next slide, please. Now, one of the more interesting changes as a result of our practice was a result of the COVID pandemic. We, like everybody else, ran into some hiccups in the very beginning, but over time we transitioned from what were in-person hearings to remote hearings for some time. We've since returned to in-person hearings. But through that experience, we made significant investments in IT infrastructure to be able to stream in ways that we had not before, to be able to provide information quickly in ways that was not previously possible. And so in many ways, the challenges we had to overcome as a result of the COVID pandemic were really a test bed for practices that we're now bringing to bear in terms of offering education, information, and awareness to stakeholders throughout the state. One particular area where this has proven invaluable is in our public hearings. We regularly have public hearings for rate cases, proceedings, and other actions, and typically they would be in person. And you would get at an in-person hearing a certain turnout of individuals. What we're finding is our WebEx versions of those hearings, we will have hundreds of individuals in attendance, which can certainly be a taxing event after several hours of being in a public hearing. But it's one way through which we have democratized the process further, allowing more individuals to have their voices heard and creating a platform that's far more equitable and convenient for everyone involved. Next slide, please. So in looking through what our next steps are, so again, we want to continuously work to improve the nature of our website as one of our prime points of interface with the general public. And in doing so, we want to ensure that there's educational materials available that people can utilize. We're developing primers that are publicly accessible, that'll give people an overview of what is a rate case. We've taken some lessons learned from other public service commissions in terms of their use of social media and how they communicate there to varying degrees. And we're trying to incorporate those lessons learned into our own efforts to ensure that our social media presence is robust enough and attractive enough that people will want to see what's going on at the commission, will be willing to engage in the commission and find value in doing so. And then finally, we want to give everyone tools through which they can engage, not just educating them on how to, but provide them with templates and other documents that allow them to provide testimony more easily than they otherwise would be able to. Again, the name of the game here is lowering the barrier to entry to the maximum degree possible to democratize the process and allow as many people to engage. And in doing this, the challenge we have to always pay attention to is how do we ensure that participation and that accessibility can be balanced with the legal expectations of the processes that we have in place. We're working through that now with in partnership with many stakeholders, actually, to trying to find that right balance. And I think that's a key part of this. We're not doing this alone. We're not doing this in isolation. We have a very rich ecosystem of stakeholders in New York State. The Public Utility Law Project for one, the Office of Utility Intervention, the Utility Intervention Office for another. And this is in addition to a broad ecosystem of environmental justice groups, as well as large environmental groups, industrial groups, commercial enterprises, IDCs, lots of stakeholders engage. And it's through those conversations that we see opportunities for improvement, and we're exploring those. So a real important takeaway here, whatever it is done, don't do it in isolation, don't do it in a vacuum, do it in partnership with the very people who seek and already do engage. Next slide, please. And as a next step in doing that, we need to recognize that there are internal processes we need to cultivate and manage better. We at the PSC are at the forefront of the CLCPA, both in authorizing investments for the build out of renewable energy, authorizing energy efficiency funds for use in commercial and residential and industrial applications. And one of the things we want to make sure that the various groups within the PSC have at front of thought in various actions and decisions is understanding how equity plays a role in the various actions that we take. And we have long had low and moderate income programs. We've long advanced, weatherization efforts for low income households, but there are other factors that come into play, particularly as we make significant investments in improvement of the system. And we want to make sure that we have a team established that can work from an equity lens with the various aspects of commission activities, from gas system planning, electric system planning, to our economics team, to our safety teams, all of the above. And so that is a key aspect of a next step in the process for the PSC in doing this. And we have a number of work streams that we're pursuing. Everything from, again, building the capacity of the stakeholders in our communities, as I talked to earlier, improving how the stakeholders can engage and their ability to do so, but also our ability to coordinate between state agencies and assess the various interplay of our various regulations. We work very regularly with the State Department of Environmental Conservation and other agencies as well, and ensuring that we can do that effectively without running into conflicts and creating obstacles is going to be essential. So we're trying to make sure we have these processes in place for all levels of stakeholder engagement, not just external stakeholders looking to comment, but also state partners, among others. And then importantly, you can't change what you can't measure. So tracking and reporting relevant metrics is something that we are attempting to do. There's a wide array of opinions on what the right metrics are. And we're trying to ensure that we cast a wide net, but not such a wide net as to lose the opportunity for being effective in any particular area. So we're approaching that very carefully and trying to strike a balance, as we always do. Next slide. And then finally, what I'll close is some minor changes to our website, which we've done in the last year, which have already proven to be very significant and very helpful, according to the stakeholders. Would you mind clicking? I think there's an animation here. Right, so you'll note there are two things circled here. Up on the upper left is the opportunity to translate the page to a multitude of different languages. This is something that we have worked hard to do and ensure that language access is something that's integral to everything we do. So if an order is not available in the language you seek, we have services where we will translate those orders to the desired language of an individual needing them if the English is not their first language. Additionally, for first-time visitors who've never visited the site before, as I'm sure you can all imagine, navigating a Public Service Commission website with all the various dockets, filings, and other activities can be a challenge. So we created a first time here button. which essentially allows people, when you click on that button, you're brought to what we have found to be the most frequently accessed information or requested information. And that updates regularly. If we have an ongoing proceeding that we know is a high priority item that a lot of people want to know about, when you click that first button there, that will be the first thing you see, followed by other things deemed high priority at the time. And then if you don't see what you're looking for, towards the very bottom, information on how to access more information, different parts of our websites with additional context explaining what they do. And again, this has been a very impactful change to our website. And we believe this is one of the drivers of what has been a 30% increase in social media activity throughout our various platforms, from LinkedIn to Twitter, and everything in between. So we're seeing positive changes already. We have many more plans to be developed, and this is just a small overview of what we are looking to implement over the next few months. But we anticipate even greater success over time, and look at this as just a starting point. This will be a continuous evolution, not a single activity with a single destination. So setting up internal operations to continuously improve will be an important step and an essential step in making sure we can achieve the success we want. So that is my presentation, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Chair Christian. I really appreciate it and apologize. I was very flustered at the onset after running around the whole office looking for some internet somewhere.
No worries, no worries.
So I have a different setting. Thank you so much for your presentation. I learned a lot, and just wonderful to see some of the work you all are doing there in New York. So I'll start out with a question, but Commissioner Plant, Chair Blank, if you all have any questions for Chair Christian, feel free to turn your cameras on and tee them up. So the first, you had talked about, kind of beginning to measure success, and perhaps I'm ahead of myself because we have to take all the actions and then measure. But I'm always kind of trying to think of that in advance in terms of what outcomes really matter. What outcomes do we want to be tracking? And I was just curious, do you all have insights as to kind of the metrics or the outcomes that you think? Is it a precise level of participation? Is it outcomes of cases, outcomes in communities? How are you thinking of how to frame kind of what outcomes you're going to try to track in, what you discussed as kind of a broad net?
So the outcomes are going to vary significantly. You're going to have some that are simply numerical metrics. Others are going to be based on the relationships we have with the stakeholders themselves. Case in point, we had one stakeholder who will remain unnamed, who filed something that we did not necessarily think was the right way to go about doing things. We issued an order, we explained what was going on, and we had a number of conversations with them as to the error in the approach, something they just did not understand. And in the past, we simply would have taken their petition, responded, issued an order, called it a day, and that would have been that, and they would have been left questioning, well, what did we do that for? But instead, we worked with them, tried to understand what they were trying to accomplish, and highlighted the error in their initial approach and gave them suggestions on how better to approach this in the future. And that has led to far more favorable interactions down the line subsequently. So that is, you can't really measure that in terms of a number, but you can in terms of staff time and resources in managing similar petitions in the future is certainly lesser than it would have been otherwise. The type of metrics I find most valuable are metrics that are multifaceted. Metrics that don't just indicate one particular outcome, but an improvement of the ecosystem as a whole. And I have to give credit to my counterpart, Grace Ralph from Hawaii. I think, and hopefully she'll be presenting this later today, but a presentation I saw her give some time ago, she highlighted some performance metrics that Hawaii were utilizing. And I think those are the kind of metrics that work well, metrics that not just help the bottom line of the individuals, the various rate payers, but also help benefit the overall health and well-being of the system. And that can come in the form of helping reduce energy for certain communities that otherwise are very energy intensive. And we know from the literature and from our own work, low-income communities often have a far higher energy burden than wealthier or middle-income communities. And so every dollar earned, more of that dollar goes towards energy spend than other individuals with greater means. So identifying ways to reduce that energy spend through weatherization, through behavior change, through more efficient appliances and everything else in between, not only helps them to save money, but it also helps lower their impact on the energy system as a whole, lowering their demand and creating benefits for all other ratepayers. So we're trying to find the right balance of metrics that can similarly be multifaceted and multi-beneficial.
Well, no pressure, but
No pressure.
we'll be watching. I have one more, Chair Blank, and it's just in looking at the outreach kind of, I guess, education and outreach ecosystem. We're a smaller state, especially in terms of population, probably a smaller staff at the PUC. So some of our approach could be engagement by the utility to their customers to keep them informed on what's going on before the PUC or about certain filings or things like that. So I was just curious, does your approach include any kind of specific directives to the utilities in terms of what outreach they do, especially, in certain communities, on certain topics, or are you all primarily focused on kind of the outreach and education from the PSC to the end customers?
So what I shared today is largely PSC focus out to all ratepayers in general. In terms of work with utilities in that way. So yes and no to varying degrees. Various utilities have various energy efficiency programs and low and moderate income programs. It varies across the state as to the purpose and direction and overall impact. But those programs are already in place, and we work with them to determine their efficacy and allocate funding as needed to deploy whatever is needed to achieve the metrics desired. Those usually come in the form of rate cases, and that happens there. I think what you're suggesting is the idea of having the utilities be that voice to highlight different activities in the commission. To some degree, they do that already, to varying degrees and for varying purposes. That's something I think I will take back a bit and look into a little bit more. I think there may be some opportunities there we haven't considered. So thank you for that thought.
Happy to help, Chair.
No problem.
Christian. Chair Blank, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for joining us. As Commissioner Goman said, we're a small state, and I think there's a lot we can learn. I guess for me, in Colorado, I'd say as much as a third of our customers are income qualified and maybe more in disproportionately impacted communities. And I just sometimes worry that our clean energy and bill assistance programs sort of systematically target the most sophisticated customers who can opt in. And I think there's a much smaller universe, maybe 1 to 2% of our customers who are at risk of permanent disconnect. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering if you do anything to better understand who's disconnected, permanently disconnected, how they're targeted, and whether there's anything we can do to really help those people. I think there are statistics that say, 10% of homeless people in Denver, mm-hmm. Cite inability to pay utility bills as a significant contributing factor. So is there anything you can help us that, reach out to these most in need people, especially since we find out like when they're 2 months in arrears or 3 months in arrears, mm-hmm. by then, the rent problem. I mean, it's like almost too late to do anything. So anything you can guide us for on targeting those customers, or how do you get to people who are not likely to opt in?
So that could easily be a 30-minute discussion. So what I'm going to try to do is
Yep.
hit the high points,
Yeah.
and then I can follow up with you on some details later on. So structurally in New York State, before disconnect, all the utilities are required to provide people who are in arrears, behind on their payments, a deferred payment agreement, which is essentially a payment plan. If you're $200 behind, they'll spread that out over a year or two or three as a $10, $5 cost amortized on your bill. This is by default. What we have found is when people get close to being disconnected, they almost always move forward with this plan. And with the plan in place, you are not disconnected, right? You keep up your bills, you do what you can, you try to pay off the arrears. So structurally, we have that system in place to prevent disconnections in general. We additionally have efforts and laws in place where disconnections are not allowed during certain periods of time. So there's a uniform no disconnection policy for natural gas during the heating season. No one's losing their gas service in the winter for non-payment. Just not going to happen. But similarly, during extreme heat periods, we also do not disconnect electric customers. So that's just another form of protection that's in place during those periods of time. Now, the deeper part of your question is, how do you ensure those that need funding to pay their bills get funding to pay their bills? And to answer this, I'll do the best that I can, as this is something that we spent a very long time working on. And again, this could easily be a 30-minute discussion. We were fortunate enough to obtain funding during the COVID pandemic to help pay arrears for low and moderate income New Yorkers who were affected by the COVID pandemic. When you look at New York State arrear figures over time, they were fairly steady state, and then the pandemic came and they shot through the roof. So we wanted to make sure that we could address that before that turned into not just a problem for the individuals themselves, but also would affect the utilities' profitability, or utilities' earnings, address their credit ratings, lead to higher cost of financing, and ultimately raise rates for everyone. And ultimately, all that bad debt would be paid by all the other ratepayers anyway. So it becomes a very vicious cycle if you don't manage it as quickly as possible. So I have one member of our team here, Dakin Lee Cakes. He's our chief administrative law judge. I have another member who I'd hope would be able to join. He's not able to make it today. He could speak to this far more detail and more intelligently than I. But the long and short, we worked for quite some time in partnership with various state agencies that provide benefits to low-income individuals. So WIC programs, food programs, various other benefits. We found a way to come up with an agreement where information would be shared and data checked between those agencies and the utilities. And we then identified the pool of individuals who are receiving benefits. And these individuals, what we then found in working with the utilities, were also among the largest share of those arrears that were accruing. So we did this check. We were able to work out a way to make that happen. And then we were able to get funding through the state government and some utility funding as well to actually pay off those arrears that were accrued from the start of the pandemic up to a point 1.5 to 2 years later. And if I'd known this was going to come up, I would have brought the chart. But it's a very interesting chart to see where flat lines and then the COVID pandemic hits, arrears go up, and we pay the bills. And there's a sharp decline in the total number of arrears. Now, post that, it did creep up a little bit, but not to the degree it was, and not at the rate of increase as it did at the peak of the pandemic. So that program, which was originally a one-time thing, has proven so successful, we've now adapted it and turned it into an ongoing affordability program. And the commission long ago established a target that energy burdens should not exceed 6% of household income. And what we're able to do with the success of this program, we now have the income information of individuals. It's tied to the accounts that they possess. We did not capture everyone, but we believe we've captured 70 to 80% of the population. And we're able to provide those benefits on a recurring basis to that pool of population. So a lot of hard work, but once the system was set up, we can refine it over time, and we can become far more targeted over time as we get more information and more clarity from the individual customers on the utility side and the individuals receiving benefits.
Well, I won't take a half hour here, but would love to follow up with your team because I'd really like to know more about who these people are, and whether there's systematic biases by race, age, location, and if there's more we can do to help. And it sounds like you may be ahead of us. So thank you.
My pleasure.
Well, Chair Christian, I really sincerely want to thank you for joining us. I know it's getting late in New York, so I understand you might not stand to join us until the end, but just learned a lot from you, and we feel very fortunate to have you in our orbit. And whether you like it or not, you might hear from us in the future with more questions to get more insights from you and a lot of the great work that you've been doing.
Hopefully he likes it.
Thank you. Well, listen, I enjoyed the presentation. Thank you for putting this together, and happy to continue the conversation. And Eric, I'll follow up with you by email on that follow-up discussion.
Thank you so much. Really, very much appreciate your time.
All right.
Thanks, Rory.
Take care.
Thanks. So next, I want to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Berenice Garcia Teles. Berenice is a sustainability professional committed to advancing economic development and sustainability initiatives in minority communities. She's passionate about driving positive change and has successfully organized and implemented numerous equity initiatives to benefit frontline community members in Denver and Boulder counties. She has experience connecting under-resourced communities to sustainability programs to advance climate action and equity. For example, in launching Longmont's first bilingual sustainable business program and leading a strategy aiding equity priority buildings in meeting the Energized Denver Building Performance Ordinance. Berenice holds a master's in environmental engineering and has lived in several countries. These experiences have contributed to her depth and richness of her work. So Berenice, happy to have you join us, and hopefully I'm slightly smoother than before when I was late and frantic about my internet. So apologies to Chair Christian that you got a much better introduction than he did. But thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, and I need to please cut me if I reach 3:30 because I need to pick up my kid. So just let me know if I take too much time. Okay, friends, thank you for having me today. I'm going to show you some of my experiences in how I have engaged community members and what we have done here in Denver. So please bear with me and feel free to interrupt me if you have any burning question. Okay, some important concepts that I want you to have in mind are frontline communities. And these communities experience the first and the worst of the consequences of climate change. These communities are low to medium income. They have been historically excluded from the system. Think about people of color, the LGBTQ community, people coming out from jail that they cannot find jobs, people emigrating to this country and they don't have papers. Think about these communities. And also underserved areas, underserved neighborhoods where living costs has increased, the air quality is very bad. We have many barriers for those communities. So in Denver, we develop an equity index, and you can see it's like an L shape. So we're targeting efforts around these areas. Something to share about the common barriers that these communities face are language. We come from different countries. We don't speak the language, so it's very difficult to get access to information or to apply to programs. How to navigate the system, right? Well, all the paperwork that we have to do to get a permit, to open our food truck, etc. It's very complicated and different than what we do in our countries. Lack of trust in government. We come from countries where we don't trust in the government. So when we have people in a room and we ask them about what do you think, how do you want us to invest money, they don't believe it because they haven't had that experience in their countries. The digital divide, the immigration status, economic barriers, they don't know where to apply, to whom trust. Also, some of them, they feel that they cannot afford anything to the conversation because they are not a technical experts, they don't know anything about energy efficiency, etc. And others, they feel they don't qualify for rebates or they don't know the location, where to apply, etc. These are just some common barriers I wanted to share with you. So friends, agencies, before doing any engagement, we need to build our internal equitable infrastructure. Before you put in flyers, before you're calling for public comment, make sure you have an equitable infrastructure. Do research. We have a lot of data. In Colorado, we have the Enviro screen that can help us guide some of our initiatives. Do neighborhood visits. Visit the neighborhood that you want to target. Partner with economic and community-based organizations because they already know all the barriers, all the needs those target communities have. Have budget. That is very important. If you want to do equitable engagement, you need to have allocated budget for that. Because sometimes you have to compensate community members. You have to take, buy an Uber for a community member that you know is people with disabilities to come to join the conversation, pay for food, pay childcare, and all of that is costly. And so we need to have a budget. And also make bilingual and cultural appropriate marketing materials. And also have a staff that speak the language. That's very important. Sometimes we have to be flexible in eligibility and criteria. We have many income qualifying documents, and there are some, people that are undocumented. They cannot provide a W-2. They cannot provide a slip, a pink slip, and things like that. So maybe allow the ITIN or a tax return document to be part of the conversation to allow them to participate in your program, and all of that, will lead to build trust with them. I like to show this figure because not everyone wants an apple. And we talk about that target universalism. Maybe someone wants a banana or a mango. So make sure that in your mind, you need to design an incentive, a program where the people that lives in a mobile home that is not weatherized, that they only speak English, is a single parent, undocumented, can participate in your program. Because if you design a program for this community member, it will be easier for the rest of the community to join your initiative, to participate. And I will tell you a recipe how to do it. Put this in your mind. It's not easy. It takes time, and you need to be patient. And our agencies have to do the hard work. We need to do the hard work. And this is a great opportunity for procurement with CBOs. In this picture, for example, is when Commissioner Gilmore and her staff, we partner with a CBO in Montbello to have a listening session about the clean heat plan. And we asked them, hey, tell us how to set up this meeting. Tell us what to do. Tell us how to, with marketing to bring, things like that. They are your best asset. Trust, meet people where they are. As I told you, do neighborhood visits, have conversations in their offices. Try to use non-traditional communication channels. They are not going to answer your emails, your surveys. You need to sometimes even send them text messages. Some of the communities I have worked, they love text messaging through Facebook and WhatsApp. And you can imagine how many transactions I have done in WhatsApp and have been very successful. Build trust via economic and community strategies. And then they can reflect on the environmental aspects, because if you just tell them, hey, business owner, I want to talk to you about how we can save the planet, how we can reduce emissions, they won't care because they have basic needs to address. Remember the Maslow needs? So we need to address those basic, and how sustainability can address those basic needs, because once you hit that target, they become rock stars, they start participating, and they trust you, and they want to implement more. So in this example, what I did in the past is I use all the COVID grants and PPP loans. I partnered with the Latino Chamber of Commerce because they already have, strategies, avenues to talk to this audience. So I told them, hey, let's partner. I will help you, promote COVID grants, PPP loans. And that helped me build trust with these community members. So after they got grants, they started to trust me and started to think about sustainability and how they can really help their bottom line. And one example is during COVID, I helped assist 60 Latinx businesses in applying for this type of loans. And they were so grateful, they built trust. And after that, they started to join the Sustainable Business Program. And 23 of them became a sustainable business. They got the certification, they changed LED lights, they add bike racks, they started to do composting, recycling, just because I held it at the beginning through an economic strategy that at that moment at that moment is not connected to sustainability, but it really helped them their bottom line. And now they are, participating. Even we have ambassadors, etc. It was really cool initiative. So something I want to mention, that adapting the system to make it more flexible is not bending the rule. It's just adapt system for these community members to participate in your program. And that's why I mentioned at the beginning to have flexibility in protocols, in criteria, what the paperwork you require. And also something to have in mind is that BIPOC people, or something that the previous speaker was mentioning, is like we are early adopters too. There are some community members that belong to the BIPOC group that they have higher income, but we haven't done enough marketing to target those communities. Like for EVs, how many times we see a Latino man driving a Tesla? We don't. So how we make things more intentional that represent these communities? Also, something that the previous speaker mentioned as well, qualitative metrics are also important. And when we build trust, we have a safe platform for them to tell us whether or not this program is working or not, what are the gaps, and so on. And people, and something that happens when you build trust is that they started to ask you for other resources, for other initiatives. So you have to be open to answer those questions. And those key participants, like the picture I show you, they become your key ambassadors, your rock stars. They will start helping you promoting all your programs. And also diversify your staff. That is an asset, very important. I applaud to Denver for hiring me because I'm able to connect in other language to the community members in Denver. I look like them, and that is an asset. And they also, that helps with trust. And also try to make to have decision makers at the management level, because when they see that someone that looks like them is one that make the shots, even the community wants to support them more. And of course, they have to be qualified. And and this cultural broker is going to be your champion because he will be connected to different assets within your program, and that is very, very, very key to make your program successful. And don't burn the champion. And if you don't know how to start, shadow him. Go with her, with him, with them to community visits. See how he behaves, how he talks. And I show a picture of this gentleman, Matt Hannon. He works in Boulder County. He didn't speak any Spanish at the beginning. People didn't trust him, but at the end, look, even the food truck guy asked him to take a picture with him because he built this relationship. He started to shadow me in all these visits, and now he learned, and now he's a trusted member in the community. And after giving you all those recipe and strategies, I want to tell you about our case here in Denver, how we build this trust and co-designed technical assistance to equity priority buildings. Because we have a goal in Denver, a BPS, a Building Performance Ordinance, for buildings above 25,000 square feet, commercial and multifamily. They need to reduce their energy consumption. But Denver, yeah, we have to do it. There is a climate emergency, but we wanted to do it in a way that we don't mess up the lives of people. So we wanted to make it in an equitable way. That's why we have this equitable engagement. We provide technical assistance for buildings that are under resource and need support because they are housing or they are serving these community members. I have mentioned it to you. So who are the equity priority buildings? They serve or house frontline community members with less access to resources, and these community members might face more barriers to adapting to a changing climate. We saw it in the Marshall Fire. Many community members living in the mobile homes, they were impacted, that they were not ready for these high winds. Even if their houses didn't burn, the wind affected the roofs. So we really needed to pay attention for next time. In Denver, we did outreach. I was in the streets. I had a lot of coffees with property owners, managers. We also developed an equity index that helped us identify equity priority buildings. And we did a lot of community engagement. We partnered with the Conectoras de Montbello, a local CVO, to host listening sessions with tenants. Because yes, we wanted to learn from property owners, managers, because they have to implement, strategies to reduce energy. But we also wanted to hear from tenants. This way we can create a program, a technical assistance and incentives that will help property managers, but will benefit tenants. And we work with Excel, with CPACE, Energy Rich Colorado, and others. This is an example of some of our marketing that, thanks to the equity index, we decided that we need to host listening sessions in Spanish and listening session with interpretation to Vietnamese, and now one of my colleagues is doing in Amharic. And so it's very important that we do it in cultural relevant, and the marketing is also in that language, because it will build trust and people will feel more engaged. And putting the logo of the community organization also helps, because if they see that, oh, Buku West is organizing an event, me as a community member, I'm gonna go because I trust that organization. And don't make it very, very governmental look, because sometimes people is afraid and they don't want to join. Here are some of the things that we did. This is a picture with the Vietnamese community on the federal in Denver. Here is with the African American community. They were telling, I brought a big map of Denver neighborhoods, and they were indicating which buildings we should support based on their eyes. Then we have a community conversation here with tenants of natural occurring affordable housing. They told us their thoughts. Here we had a virtual conversation with property owners and managers, because we wanted to hear, what were their barriers, what do they need to comply with the ordinance. So it was very, very, very engaging. It was a great story. It's a great story to tell that happened with us in Denver. So here is the equity priority building, and this one help us identify buildings. And these criteria, we develop them with the community, with our equity advisory group, with service providers, and we are identifying through these criteria affordable housing buildings, people that are located in street neighborhoods with a high equity index prioritization. As I told you, we as the community, buildings are important for them, because sometimes we have food deserts, and maybe the 7-Eleven is the only building that has a grocery shopping that is important for that neighborhood. If we put, very strict policies into that 7-Eleven, 7-Eleven will go away, and now the community won't have a place to go and buy groceries. Also, we're helping nonprofits that provide human service providers, think about, food shelters, people helping the homeless, things like that. We're helping them, but we need to make sure they are responsible for the HVAC system, or they have a say in the utility bill. Otherwise, it's very hard for them to do upgrades because they don't have the final say. Also, we identify buildings located in census tract below the Denver's median income with a high priority equity index, and also they need to be serving frontline communities, because there are buildings that they might not be within the L shape, but they are maybe in a more affluent neighborhood, but they help people with disabilities. We also want to help those type of buildings. And of course, those buildings are natural occurring affordable housing, because we don't want to display people or gentrify communities just because they need to meet with the ordinance. And for commercial buildings, currently we're refining our criteria, but currently we're looking at corporate social responsibility operations. So thanks to all that community engagement, co-creation, data tools, cafecitos, neighborhood visits, etc., we were able to identify equity priority buildings, and potentially we have 490. And as you can see, the majority are in the residential sector. And within the residential sectors, the majority are naturally occurring affordable housing. So we need to make sure we are outreaching, making sure they know there is a technical assistant that can help them with that building performance ordinance. Otherwise, they can get fines or penalties if they don't report their data. So we're working with them to avoid that. And some of the metrics I want to show you is that from those 490 buildings, 169, are enrolled in the program, and 70 of them, especially from the National Current Affordable Housing, they benchmark for the first time. So our outreach was very successful because these buildings didn't have any idea about the ordinance, but we went where they are. We built trust, and now they are working with us. We also did on-site visits, and we're 183, and 16 of these buildings are doing on-site audits, HRA level 2. And we are guiding them, connecting them to financial resources. We are funnel them to some of our incentives, because we also, through this engagement, my colleagues develop electrification pilots to support equity priority buildings in upgrading their HVAC systems. And some of the equity-related programming and impact, one of them, as I told you, are the electrification pilots. 50% of all the incentives are going to equity priority buildings. And of course, that funding is coming 100% from our climate protection fund that we have in Denver. That is coming from sales tax, because the voters of Denver enacted that. And some of the audience receiving these benefits are affordable housing, nonprofits, BIPOC tenants and owners. We also have the Healthy Homes program. 100% of the funding comes from the Climate Protection Fund, and we're helping, especially on the L shape in Elyria, Swansea, near Westwood. We're helping communities that have a low air quality index. They are low income, they have respiratory problems, so we're helping them with changing envelope, installing air purifiers, changing HVAC to heat pumps, and that's a very cool program. And then we have the building performance compliance assistance, the one I manage, just to making sure we're providing technical assistance to equity priority buildings in meeting the ordinance. We're helping them to benchmark, to check, to make sure that they have the right target. If they need to change their timeline, we can also support them with that. Energy assessment, virtual and in person. So that is going very well. I'm happy with the results. This year, we're going to do a survey analysis for the pilot that we started last year, just to check what are the gaps, what are the opportunities that we are not seeing. The property owners can tell us, hey, Bernice, this is not working, maybe you should do this. We want to hear from them. And also we have funding for new construction. If there is a developer that wants to build affordable housing, so he can apply to that new funding incentive. And other tools for other CASA programs is policy work. So we can provide recommendations to Excel Energy, to the PUC. Hey, these neighborhoods are telling us that, how you are addressing this. Now we have a promotoras. It's a group of community members that they go around underserved neighborhoods, teaching the community about the impacts of climate change and so on. We have also the solar cups, where we are targeting neighborhoods that are underserved and how we can install more solar and so on. Just some takeaways, and the previous speaker said as well, that the COVID aftermath is forcing people, agencies to act more responsible for the long term. Sustainability, climate action, PUC offices can be an asset to underserved communities just because of the angle they manage. And partnerships are key. And during a time of crisis, remember, identify those key ambassadors, key organizations, because they will be your best asset, great allies, and diversify your staff. That is very, very important to help increase trust in the community. And if you don't have enough resources, because some people say, oh, I don't have funding, but partner with organizations like I did with the Latino Chamber, because they have already values aligned to what I wanted to do. Partner with those type of organizations because they already know your community and they might have funding that can align to what you want to do. And remember, do target universalism, because that advances equity. And we want long-term solutions here, right? Where we do energy efficiency improvements, we reduce greenhouse gases, we reduce waste, we lower our utility bills so people can save money. And with that money that they save, they can hire new people. we must lead with empathy, my friends. That's key in all this work. Otherwise, we won't arrive very far. And just some takeaways from the equity buildings, like we're identifying them, we're engaging with the community, we're trying the best to avoid unintended consequences, and we're doing our best to direct investment to people and areas of need. And this improves equity because it lowers the utility bills, helps them save money. Some buildings didn't have any cooling, so through our incentives, our pilots, they are getting cooling through the heat pumps, less exposure to bad gases and improve our air quality. And something I really like is that we are building trust. So communities, for the first time, maybe, who knows, they are feeling seen and heard by us. And that is very important. And something I like to say that we have the responsibility to change the world, but we need individuals to get there. And I think that's all. I can answer any question. Thank you for the invite.
Thank you, Berenice. Really appreciate you being able to join us today and all the wonderful information you've provided here. I wasn't clear. I know you have to leave for a child pickup. It sounds like at 3:30. Are you able to join us for the Q&A at the end, or will you be off by then?
Yeah, I think I can. I just need to pick up my kids, so I will be on the phone, but I can come back. But I will put my email on the chat in case someone wants to reach out to me in case I'm not able to connect. But thank you for the invite and for having the space to share some of my experiences.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, that's very helpful. I think given the timing, which is very largely my fault on the connection issues, I think we'll probably hold questions until the Q&A at the end. So hopefully you'll be able to jump back on and join us then. And that way I can ensure we get to our other speakers. Thank you so much for sharing all of your great work and knowledge here in the Denver area. Very, very helpful. Next, I'm going to turn to Tara Dornfeld and Angie McKinley. And they're with the Minnesota PUC. Tara Dornfeld is an analyst at the Minnesota PUC. Her work focuses on natural gas resource planning and metrics to evaluate new programs offered by utilities like AMI meters and Xcel Energy's Resilient Minneapolis project. She's also the Commission's public engagement specialist, where she focuses on increasing access to Commission processes, including through the amplification of experiential knowledge alongside technical knowledge. Prior to joining the Commission, Tara earned a doctoral degree in policy and planning from the University of California, Irvine. Before that, she was a sea turtle biologist. That is a new one for one of our meetings, so I'm very excited about that, Tara, and ran a research and conservation project in Costa Rica. Angie McKinley is the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Coordinator for the Minnesota PUC, where she develops training for staff and leadership and provides direction, project management, and guidance for implementing the agency's DEI goals. Prior to her current role, Angie led efforts to grow diversity, equity, and inclusion in the architecture profession with an emphasis on gender and racial equity. Her experience in facilitating culture change is augmented by her certification as a qualified administrator of the Intercultural Development Inventory Assessment and the Intercultural Conflict Style Inventory. Angie holds a master's degree in art history from the University of St. Thomas, which also sounds really lovely. So welcome to both of you, and really excited to hear your presentation.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Gilman. I am going to go ahead and share my screen here so we can get our slides started. Can everyone see that okay? All right. I'm going to kick things off, and then I will, Tara and I will kind of hand it back and forth over the course of the presentation. Before we dive in, I'd just like to thank the commissioners and Jesse for the invitation to participate in this meeting and in this conversation today. Tara and I are both really passionate about the work that we're doing at the Minnesota PUC, and we're really eager to learn more about what's happening in other regulatory spaces around the country. So our presentation intends to share more about some of the processes and efforts that we've put into place to embed equity into our regulatory process and to make our public engagement processes more accessible, equitable, and inclusive. And we'll also touch on some of the outcomes that we're seeing of this work. So I first want to just identify some of the drivers that motivated us to start doing this work. And I'll say that our commissioners have been a huge driver. We have a group currently who have really pushed for equity to be a consideration in the regulatory process, and others within our agency's executive leadership who have been champions for making some of these changes that we've instituted. So we're fortunate to really have buy-in and investment from the top down. Another driver was a docket in 2021 that drew a huge amount of public attention. Some of you may recall Enbridge's Line 3 pipeline replacement project. And so as a result of that, the Office of the Legislative Auditor issued a report evaluating the Commission's public engagement processes and making some suggestions for improvements. Tara's role as a public engagement specialist was created as a result, as was an interagency public engagement work group that was formed to help clarify some of the roles and processes and to implement some of those changes suggested in the report. And that was all during the pandemic. So as we've adjusted to kind of a post-COVID world, we continue to make adjustments and changes to accommodate this more hybrid world for meetings and events and new ways of engaging. Oops, sorry. Let's get back to this. There we go. So I'll first talk a little bit about the effort we've rolled out to build a record that more intentionally centers equity. The Minnesota PUC's DEI statement expresses its commitment to address diversity, equity, and inclusion in the industries we regulate. So in January of this year, the agency implemented a new process intended to develop a record that includes equity concerns and that allows commissioners to apply an equity lens in their decision-making. So analysts are now asked to include equity-focused questions in notices of comment and in information requests wherever possible. And as our DEI committee developed a series of sample questions that could help guide analysts. And then I serve as kind of a resource or consultant to assist analysts in developing these questions. And this is a new process. It's still in the works, but as we roll it out, we intend to measure the progress and success by tracking the questions that are being asked and analyzing their impact on the record. So noting the number of responses to a particular question, analyzing which parties are responding to those questions, and identifying whether any of those equity-related concerns are being included in the decision options and whether those concerns are part of the commission orders for each docket where an equity question was asked. And we hope to use this data to evaluate the effectiveness of specific equity questions and expect that that will help us shape more effective questions in the future. This is a screenshot of the process that analysts use to prepare their notices for filing. And you can see highlighted in yellow that we've added a step requiring staff to indicate whether or not an equity question was asked and to provide a rationale if there was no equity question. And there is a document linked there, which is the sample questions. And my email address is also there in the event that folks wish to consult with me. It's really important that for this process to be effective, we have all parties understanding the same things. And so we plan to hold a planning meeting for stakeholders and parties where we can get that shared meaning on what do we mean when we say equity, and get some feedback from the parties and interveners. And I'll turn it over to Tara.
Thanks, Angie. Thanks. Thank you, Angie. And thank you, Jesse, for organizing. Thank you, commissioners, for this opportunity to speak today. And so Angie was talking about building the record, and I'll speak about sort of if a notice goes out, it goes out into one of our dockets. And that means the folks that will see that notice are anyone who is on our service list. And for each matter before the commission, we build a service list based on groups who have participated in similar matters. So this means almost by rule, we always hear from the same people and reach out to the same people. So we've started an initiative to do more proactive outreach. And so first we started with all groups who had commented in a PUC proceeding, but had maybe PUC proceedings had dropped off their radar or they had had staff changes. So we sent them sort of we've missed hearing from you email. We also looked at groups participating in other energy workspaces and reached out to them. And for us, we see a lot of participation clustered in our metropolitan area, so around the St. Paul capital and Minneapolis, our twin cities. So finding geographically diverse stakeholders was important. We wanted to make sure we were reaching both that urban group who have seemed very involved in our dockets, as well as rural groups, especially because we know these two groups face very different issues, especially, for example, reliability. So we wanted to consciously find groups outside of that metropolitan bubble and reach out to them, say, you know, Angie and I are working at the commission. We have resources for your participation. We can let you know about dockets that you might be interested in. And please, if you know of anyone else that could connect with us or does work in the energy space, please let us know and connect us with them. So our next steps will be to schedule one-on-one meetings to build relationships. And we also have been thinking, we ask a lot of groups if they are going to participate in our meetings in terms of resources like time, financial resources. And so we've been thinking a lot about what we can give back to those groups. And we think that connecting groups to others who might be doing similar work, serving as that connector, as well as sort of having the power to convene groups and bring them together and put their ideas before the commission, could hopefully be at least a start of incentives for folks to participate in our proceedings.
So Tara, myself, and our tribal liaison, Charlie Bruce, have worked to make our public meetings more accessible and inclusive in an effort to advance procedural justice. So in addition to doing things like making improvements to our website, ensuring digital accessibility, we're trying some new things to make the process of participating in dockets and the related activities more inclusive. So some of these things that we've tried are creating a database of public meeting venues that are easy for the public to locate and accessible from public transportation modes, and sharing that database with utilities when they are responsible for scheduling and selecting the venues. Allowing for multimodal commenting options. So not just taking written comments, but using a court reporter to take verbal comments, allowing for comments to be filed via video. We've even included a comment card on bill inserts for some of the utilities. We hope to be able to use some of the environmental justice mapping tools to identify environmental justice communities who may be impacted by a policy or project and be more intentional about making outreach to them. We've done some work to simplify our public meeting notices and use more plain language, aiming for a 7th to 8th grade audience reading level. We've hosted virtual trainings and webinars on kind of Public Utilities Commission 101 that Tara has hosted. We've made some kind of simplified videos of the public process on our website. And we've considered employing some tools like the NARUC stakeholder engagement decision-making framework and an equity analysis tool that the State of Minnesota Governor's Office has recently published to be able to systematize some of these efforts and do some more concrete evaluation of them.
All right. And I can talk, so now we thought we would talk about a couple outcomes as a result of increased participation and a focus on equity in our work. And we're focusing on Xcel Energy because we share Xcel Energy as a utility service provider. And so first I will start with Xcel's Electric Service Quality Interactive Map. And as part of Xcel Energy's performance-based regulation docket, the Commission required the company to map locational reliability and equity in terms of customer service and reliability and energy assistance program participation against demographic variables. The company built the map and is now working with a consultant who will help the company to analyze the map and determine how to use the map across commission dockets. And so, for example, maybe geographically targeted outreach efforts. And on the slide that we're taking a look at now, I'm showing one of the metrics, customers experiencing multiple interruptions, which is defined as any electric premise that had 6 or more sustained outages in 1 year. And the map shows census block groups and what percent of customers in that census block group experienced 6 or more interruptions in the previous year. You can see the color ramp legend in the upper corner of the screen, as well as our twin cities with red stars. So St. Paul and Minneapolis, they're more in the center. And so this is one kind of exciting thing that came out of integrated resource planning, was having Xcel put this map together, and they really like it. We're eager to work on it and continue to offer it on their website. It originated in our performance-based rate-making docket. That docket is sort of on pause for the time being, but we're getting a lot of stakeholder feedback that they'd like to see this map incorporated into decision-making across proceedings. And if you'll move ahead, please, Angie, to one more. Another outcome of an Xcel proceeding, and this one is Xcel Integrated Resource Planning. Let me advance my notes one more. The IRP ordered the company to engage stakeholders in discussions of equity in terms of energy provisions. And the stated goals of this group are highlighted in yellow. Xcel Energy has convened monthly meetings with 35 different groups, energy experts, groups who don't often appear before the commission, groups that are primarily focused on work with BIPOC communities. Xcel will have held a total of 16 meetings, with their final meeting being held March 13th, so just next week. And the commission has been really hands-off. Staff has received monthly updates, has been free to attend any of the meetings if we have wanted to, but so far has relied mostly on receiving updates from the company. And there are formal annual updates that are filed in the docket associated with this proceeding. We also held a planning meeting, commission staff held a planning meeting to hear directly from participants whose voices may not have been reflected to their maybe liking in some of Xcel's filings, or just to give them a chance to speak with their own words. And if you'll move forward one more. Sure. Thanks, Angie. And so right now, the Equity Stakeholder Advisory Group, or we've been using the acronym ESAG. So the ESAG members have been focusing on 3 work streams. Issues 1 and 2 are more fully developed right now than issue 3. The company expects to put forward a proposal for an automatic discount coupled with energy efficiency, and expect that proposal before the commission this quarter. And ESAG viewed the automatic discount to certain census block groups as a short-term fix, while energy efficiency and jobs being shown in issue 2, are longer-term solutions. And I'll note that the company filed its most recent integrated resource plan for its electric operations in February of 2024, and that included a significant discussion of workforce diversity. And if you'll move to the final slide. And the final provision of the IRP order was to convene an environmental justice accountability board. And so Xcel's ESAG, the final meeting is March 13th. The group has a chance to meet with Xcel leadership, including Ryan Long, the president of Xcel in Minnesota and the Dakotas. The group will finalize plans for the petitions it will put forward before the commission, as well as continue discussions on outstanding issues. It's also moving forward with its Environmental Justice Accountability Board, including determining the selection process for board members. And the board is meant to be the long-standing iteration or form of the ESAG. And so the ESAG was sort of to get some of these projects off the ground, and the board will hopefully stand in perpetuity. And the board will continue to work through the policy issues shown on the previous slide, as well as some of the procedural issues that have been the focus of the ESAG group, things like compensation and the power of the group. And I think it's important to point out the interesting position that we've put this board in. We've asked for a board, but this is juxtaposed against the bureaucratic nature of commission work, where you have to go through a very narrow commission process in order to realize a petition or to speak with commissioners. And groups have been wanting direct access to officials in the highest positions of power, so directly to the commissioner, directly to Excel's president, to have regular meetings. But this is not typically how utility regulatory work has functioned. And so I think we're wondering how this new group might require new procedures, and we'll see that as we continue to get updates from this Environmental Justice Accountability Board.
Thank you both so much for the presentation. Really, really appreciate you sharing all this great information with us. I do have some follow-up questions with you, but given the time, I'm going to try and save questions to the end to make sure we can get through the rest of our panelists. That being said, I'm probably going to burn our break. So sorry, everyone, but my priority is make sure we share all the great insights from these wonderful panelists who are joining us. And then we can get to any questions at the end. So I sure hope you're both able to stick around. And I know we know where to find you too if we have additional follow-up questions. So thank you both so much for the presentation. I hope you'll stick around. So that being said, I'm just gonna skip the break. I'm sure folks can take a real brief break if needed on your own. But I wanna move on to ensure that we get to all of our panelists during the allotted time today. So I'd now like to welcome our next speaker, Grace Ralph with the Hawaii PUC. Grace was named the Chief of Policy of Research at the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission after serving 3 years as a senior utility analyst. She contributes to the performance-based regulation, distributed energy resource policies, and integrated grid planning efforts, among others. Previously, Grace worked at the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, focusing on utility sector energy efficiency programs and initiatives, and at Carbone Inc. as the Energy and Environmental Markets Analyst and Broker. Grace earned a Master of Public Administration in Environmental Science and Policy from Columbia University, and she holds an honors Bachelor of Science with distinction in Energy and Environmental Policy and an honors Bachelor of Arts in French from the University of Delaware. So great to meet you, Grace, and really excited to hear from you on some of what's going on in Hawaii.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you all so much for having me today. And yeah, it's been a fantastic discussion so far, and I'm excited to provide some context from Hawaii, where I think, our experience will, echo a lot of the lessons we've already heard. And yeah, hopefully raise some new ideas and questions as well. As Commissioner Gilman mentioned, my name is Grace Ralph. I'm the Chief of Policy and Research here at the Hawaii PUC, and I'm gonna provide some insight into what we are doing here in terms of community engagement. Go to the next slide. So just briefly for this presentation, and I do want to make sure we have time for questions and discussion, so I'll try to move pretty quickly, but want to talk a little bit about the impetus for action here in Hawaii specifically, and how that led to a new proceeding that we colloquially call the equity docket. I'll talk a little bit about its structure, the proposed stakeholder engagement approach, and then a bit of focus on the equity, procedural equity and affordability tracks of that docket. And then finally, I just want to leave you with some questions that continue to nag at me. Let me go to the next slide. So it will definitely be no surprise to anyone in this call that there are significant inequities in Hawaii's energy system. And there's been increasing recognition of these issues across our state. When I joined the PUC back in 2020, I had the opportunity to join a group that was just kind of getting started called the Energy Equity Hui. Hui is a Hawaiian word for group or meeting, and this was just a collaborative of government, non-government, community, nonprofit, anybody who was interested in improving energy equity outcomes in Hawaii. That group has definitely evolved over time. It's still existing and thriving today, but for me, one of the big successes of that group was that it really elevated the conversation and awareness around these challenges across diverse stakeholders, particularly at the PUC. And out of that effort, we actually connected with some lawmakers here and helped them develop resolutions that passed back in 2022 that required the PUC to address equity and justice holistically across our work. For us, that was a great reason to consolidate a lot of our existing ongoing efforts that aim to address different aspects of energy equity and to open our docket to address these issues more holistically and take a bigger view of things. The challenges I've listed on this slide were those that we actually called out in our opening order for that docket as the highest priority to address in the near term. And I know that these challenges are definitely not unique to Hawaii, but I will point out that in particular, Hawaii has the highest electricity rates in our country. I'm thinking some of you may be shocked to hear that our rates are currently around 43 cents a kilowatt hour, so almost triple the national average. We also have very limited land, especially on Oahu, our most populous island. And most of our historic fossil fuel infrastructure has been sited in highly Native American or Native Hawaiian and low-income communities. And it just so happens too that those communities also have the most land availability and the best solar irradiance in many cases. So even as we transition to renewable energy, those communities are continuing to shoulder a lot of the burden of our infrastructure. So those are some of the kind of drivers for action. And you can go to the next slide. And so in response, we opened our equity docket. In that docket, we outlined 5 work streams that aim to address a lot of those challenges I just highlighted, and to drill down on specific issues within the broad framework of energy equity and justice, and to provide meaningful opportunities for parties and individuals to propose new ideas or discuss old ones that may help improve energy equity. So these 5 work streams cover procedural equity. We were thinking that this would include developing a PUC equity and justice action plan, improving the accessibility of our proceedings, improve community engagement and education, and other aspects that we've heard some of the other speakers talk about today too. The second is affordability and direct payment assistance. So this is really intended to help make an immediate and more direct impact on customer bills and reduce the energy burden. Our third track here was siting and hosting. So how do we figure out where our projects should be sited? Is that equitable? What impact do projects have on communities? And how can we ensure that projects are mutually beneficial to communities that host them? Fourth is equitable access to clean energy. So we know that not everybody can afford or has a home to put up solar panels and reduce their bill in that way. So we wanted to expand participation in customer programs, enhance financing programs to help more people access those resources, and explore other ways to better distribute the benefits of clean energy across folks in Hawaii. And finally, is utility performance tracking. So how do we make sure that the utility is doing well? I'm excited to see some of those that our previous speakers have talked about, the distribution map that the folks in Minnesota were mentioning and those kinds of things. But how do we increase reporting and transparency? Can we change the utility business model to reduce disconnections or modify accounting practices for non-payment? Those kinds of questions would be in the utility performance tracking track. So I'm going to focus in on the first 2 in this discussion, but I'd be happy to discuss the others, in Q&A or later on as well. And go to the next slide. So we're thinking about this equity docket as a proving ground for procedural equity improvements. So A couple of things that we're doing differently in this proceeding than our typical dockets are, first, we are really intending to limit or remove entirely any barriers to participation. The first way we did that was by waiving the filing fee to participate in the docket. And we actually extended the intervention period indefinitely. So if folks come in at different times, they're welcome to intervene. That said, we hope that folks don't feel they need to formally intervene in this docket. So we're trying out new ways of more officially soliciting input, like using email blasts, accepting public comments as official docket filings, ensuring that input at meetings is officially on the record, and those kinds of ways of really gathering a robust record without requiring legal representation. We are also focusing on stakeholder engagement, as I'll get into in the next couple of slides. And we really are trying to use a listen first approach to understand communities' perspectives on equity and justice and understand what issues we need to address from those who are most impacted by our decision making. We really think of this docket as sort of the core of our initiatives to incorporate equity across our work. And in that sense, it's a little different than our other dockets as well. We will not plan to make any decisions in this docket, but rather use this docket to inform decision making in other venues. And I think this approach has benefits and drawbacks. Benefits being that we are less limited by ex parte communication rules, so we can really have one-on-one conversations and engage with people more meaningfully. But it also means that, you know, we are not actually issuing decisions here. We're more issuing things like staff reports and informing other proceedings from this. Go to the next slide. So we opened this docket in late 2022. It was kicked off by a report to our legislature, and we sort of wanted to set a foundation of key terminology that would help level set and get everybody on the same page going forward. In 2023, we spent the bulk of our time developing a work plan and working with stakeholders to identify what the key issues were and get them up to speed with PUC process. The important part of this slide is that when we solicited feedback on that work plan, stakeholders told us loud and clear that our community outreach and engagement was not yet good enough to go forward with the substance of our docket, and that we really needed more voices in the room before moving forward. So for that reason, last fall, we put a pause on the substantive pieces of the docket while we procure a consultant to help us with that community outreach piece of things. We'll go to the next slide. So as we bring this consultant on board, we plan to use or build on a typology of engagement that we outlined in our initial work plan, which envisioned 3 types of stakeholder engagement. The first was educational sessions. So because we hope to have new voices in the room, we understand that not everybody has the same background or expertise in energy and commission issues. So these will help to facilitate learning on relevant topics and allow people to engage technically in what I think are very complex issues that we're considering. The second was community sessions. And this is really, you know, open-ended for the community to tell us, to provide us with their expertise. What is their experience on the ground in their community? What perspectives do they want to share with us? And what are their ideas for improvements? And then finally, we wanted to have technical sessions. These are really intended to get into the meat of solutions. So thinking through rate design or talking about DER programs for non-homeowners, those kinds of things where it really delves more into the technical there. Things we're still grappling with and working on include, like, how do you measure the effectiveness of outreach? And I know there was a question earlier about this, but I think we're still thinking about that too. How do you measure that effectiveness? Is it number of participants? Is it number of new participants? Is it engagement over time or quality of input? And, you know, these are definitely things that we're still thinking about. Go to the next slide. So this graphic is a bit complex, and it's definitely not necessary to take in the full details. It's really just intended to demonstrate that those three types of engagements are really intended to feed into one another and feed into the docket and its outcomes. We envision that for each track, we'd start with the educational sessions to help folks get prepared, which would then lead into technical sessions. And throughout this, we would have community sessions and really, you know, could feed into one another and be very cross-collaborative. You may note that we thought very carefully about whether virtual, hybrid, or in-person meetings would be best for each type of engagement, given that we have folks across multiple islands and it's not easy to get to the commission. And so it's a careful consideration for us that I think we're still thinking through. We did start with hybrid meetings, but we found that it wasn't necessarily super effective at allowing folks to engage with us at the PUC. So we were proposing to move forward either fully virtual or fully in person, depending on the type of meeting. Go to the next slide. So just a very quick overview of the two work streams, or the work stream on procedural equity. This is intended to improve the accessibility and inclusivity of commission proceedings and to identify and pilot improvements to procedural equity for broader integration across our proceedings. When we conceptualized this, we thought, you know, this might include a commission policy statement on equity, like a vision for how we view this going forward, and then recommendations for procedures to scale the improvements that we find that work going forward. Go to the next slide. The affordability and direct payment assistance workstream was intended to improve affordability tangibly for customers, and particularly LMI, low and moderate income customers. We envision that outputs from this could include a rate discount for LMI customers or suspension of disconnections and debts, a state program to supplement the federal home energy assistance program, and potentially improvements to payment plans or other ways to reduce energy burden. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we did pause those work streams in the near term while we seek an outreach consultant. We basically determined we do not have the expertise or resources at this time at the commission to be really taking this on in a meaningful way. So we put out a scope of work for a consultant to help us, and we solicited input on it from docket participants. Right now, we're envisioning that the consultant would help us design and implement our community outreach and engagement plan, collaborate with key partners like the State Energy Office and the utilities to help ensure we are streamlining our outreach, and then really just to help sort of implement that plan. We also included in that scope of work some desired competencies, which include demonstrated community trust, especially across different communities in Hawaii, given our diversity there. We also were hoping that somebody would have knowledge of other languages like Hawaiian or other languages that are widely spoken here in Hawaii. And then, of course, you know, expertise in facilitating challenging meetings. Next slide. So I was trying to think about how to wrap up this presentation, and because we're still so much in the early days of this, I thought that rather than leave you with takeaways, I would leave you with the questions that are currently haunting me. So first, should the PUC even be doing outreach? As I mentioned, we don't necessarily currently have the expertise in-house to do meaningful engagement, and we recognize that there are other entities that are expert on this. I also wonder if it's appropriate for the PUC to be proactively reaching out to specific communities or specific people to solicit input, given our role as a neutral or, you know, as a decision maker. Or is it our role to be more focused on providing a platform and to facilitate participation rather than being proactive about going out and soliciting it? We're thinking about that question particularly in the context of renewable energy procurements. Currently, the way our system is designed is that developers do community outreach for their projects. And what this means in practice is that developers tell the utility how their community outreach has gone, and then the utility tells us how they think it's gone. And for me, that's challenging to assess in a project application when we're hearing that kind of third-hand information about what the community is telling us about projects. Another question that is kind of nagging at me is, which proceedings are most important for public outreach? Do communities and stakeholders really want to know about every transformer replacement or routine investments, those kinds of things? And relatedly, our impacted communities and prominent community leaders are often burdened with requests for input on many issues. So how can we streamline across agencies and organizations to reduce that fatigue and make sure that input is meaningful and used? And then finally, I hold a number of questions about defining community. How can we assess whether a community organization or a leader is really representative of general sentiment across a community? And what if there isn't general sentiment across a community? Here in Hawaii, too, we're challenged by actually defining community. So is it miles from a project, or for an offshore wind project, is it anybody impacted by the view shed? Should we be using neighborhood board communities? How do we really define that? And finally, who should be representing environmental justice in PUC proceedings? I wonder whether what the consumer advocate's role is when they are tasked with representing all stakeholders, or is it an environmental justice organization? Is it community members? So that's something that I'm definitely thinking about and wanting to incorporate community and stakeholder input on going forward. So I hope that those questions are thought-provoking for you. I will leave you there. You can go to the next slide. But just wanted to thank you all again for the opportunity, and I look forward to the discussion and questions.
Grace, thank you so much for joining us and for really that insightful presentation. And I very much appreciate your gnarly questions because yeah, I mean, there are things we're all going to be faced with on an ongoing basis. We might come to different answers. We might come to different answers at different points in time. But as I said to Chair Christian, I feel very fortunate to have colleagues like yourself working all across the country on some of the same issues. So at least we get to really learn from each other. So I really appreciate your time today. I hope you'll be able to stick around. I'll move us on to the next speaker just to make sure we get through it all, but certainly hoping we still have some time carved out for questions at the end so that we can engage with you a little more. So thank you so much for that. Now I'd like to welcome our next speaker, Commissioner Karen McGowan. Karen's a commissioner with the Energy and Carbon Management Conservation Commission in Colorado. Ms. McGowan spent over a decade at the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment in various positions, most recently as the Deputy Executive Director and the Director of Community Relations. She was responsible for the department's internal-external communications, legislative affairs, the Office of Health Equity, the Office of Energy Emergency Planning and Response, and the Office of Planning and Partnerships. She's also worked in public health and environment policy regarding oil and gas activities. At the Public Health Department, Ms. McGowan earned the reputation as behind-the-scenes driver of resolving problems and finding solutions. And she previously worked at the Denver Regional Council of Governments as the Director of Policy Development and Communications. She also served as Assistant Director for External Affairs with Great Outdoors Colorado in various policy and legislative capacities under Governor Roy Romer. So Commissioner McGowan, happy to have you here with us and to hear some additional perspective from within Colorado. And it sounds like you have just the background to really help us understand. So welcome and looking forward to your presentation.
Well, thanks for inviting me. It's nice to hear that. I think that all the speakers are pretty aligned, and I'm going to take a slightly different tack and use an example of a rulemaking that our commission is currently going through, and our attempts, I guess, to be better at meaningful community engagement as part of a rulemaking process. So thanks for having me today. Next slide, please. So, I think, again, I think we're all aligned when we're talking about community engagement. I think EPA has a nice synopsis as part of their community action roadmap, which is what is meaningful community engagement? Is taking steps to address a community's concerns by building trust, which a lot of us have been talking about, demonstrating genuine engagement, and ensuring that participation is valued and leads to change in how you do things or how you view things. Next slide, please. Also wanted to mention, and you all probably know about this already, but there is an Environmental Justice Action Task Force that was set up over at the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, and they made some recommendations about best practices for community engagement. And those include having CDPHE create some guidance and training on community engagement, encouraging the legislature to fund agency activities that help us do better at outreach and engagement and education, encouraging agencies to compensate community members for their time when they spend with us to give us their feedback and input, and obviously improving the way we do things with our tribal partners. Next slide, please. So this is my perspective of what we've been going through through our rulemaking and some best practices for community engagement. First of all, obviously trying to reduce the language barrier and making sure that the materials that we have are linguistically diverse and paired or tailored to the audience that we're trying to connect with. Improving customer service, meeting people where they are at a time and a place that is convenient for them. So we've really, I think, gotten used to being online a lot post-COVID. And we've heard from communities that they'd like us to actually come out and visit them and see what they're experiencing and have a conversation in person with them. Offer other accommodations if necessary. So do you have hearing impaired? Do you have are you wheelchair accessible, etc.? Offering childcare if you're doing evening meetings, offering compensation for time and expertise, and providing multiple avenues to participate in your process. So for this current rulemaking that we're going through, we're doing community meetings, we're doing informal oral feedback from folks that can just sign up and present to us what they're thinking about for our rulemaking, providing information, informal written documentation to us so that we can all use all that information to feed into how we're going to change or update our cumulative impact rules. Next slide, please. I think the most important piece, and I think that you've heard this from several of the other speakers, is making sure that you have a feedback loop. Understand what the issue is, figure out how you're going to represent that issue or the feedback that you want, figure out how to be transparent about it, figure out who you need to connect with, how you're going to connect with them, listen and get their feedback, represent that feedback in a very public, transparent way, and explain after you've heard the input as part of your process what pieces you did take and incorporate and what pieces that you did not and why you did not incorporate them. And then afterwards, figure out if there's a way to monitor or measure the changes that you've made and whether or not they feel successful to community, and report back what you did and how you did it to the community that you asked for feedback from. Next slide, please. You've heard this also from other folks. Make sure this isn't a check the box exercise. A lot of folks, especially here in Colorado, we're a small state. A lot of our state agencies are reaching out to the same communities. Our EJ communities are impacted by oil and gas, are impacted by transportation, impacted by location, Suncor. We're all kind of reaching out to similar communities, and there's a certain point at which they feel overwhelmed and fatigued. And if they're going to participate, they want to know that what they're feeding to you is meaningful and going to impact an outcome. Next slide, please. So right now, the ECMC is going through a cumulative impacts rulemaking related to two pieces of legislation. Our original mission change rulemaking, which changed the commission from voluntary to a paid commission and changed it from supporting oil and gas development to regulating it in a way that is protective of public health and environment. And then last year, the legislature said, that was a good bite at the apple, but we want to see you do more. We want you to promulgate rules that will evaluate and address the cumulative impacts of oil and gas operations. And we want you to define what cumulative impacts is and what it means. Next slide, please. So I know this seems like a lot, but we said we want to do this and we want to do it the right way. And so we actually had a kickoff listening session. We had 4 of those in January of last year. And then we met as a commission and put that feedback into buckets and said, here's what we're hearing from our stakeholders as far as what they would like to see us change or update or incorporate for cumulative impacts assessment as part of our rules. Then we had a public comment session on our annual cumulative impacts report. Then we updated the cumulative impacts report based on some stakeholder input. Then 1294 passed, which said, well, we want you to do a little bit more. Then we kicked off an informational docket, which is not a formal docket, which was our attempt to make our process feel less adjudicatory. I think our process can feel very scary, and I assume that you all as commissioners feel the same way. People do not understand how to participate. The idea of maybe having to have legal representation in order to participate in our process, being assigned specific time allocations and specific times in which you can be in front of the commission, I think feels very daunting. So we did 2 informational dockets. One was written. You have 10 pages, submit what you want to the commission about our cumulative impacts process. And then we did an oral docket and invited people to come and talk to us. You could either talk about what you submitted in writing, or if you had something different that you wanted to talk about entirely, you could do that. You did not have to have any formal stakeholder standing. Anybody could come and give their input in front of the commission. Then we had 5 community outreach meetings in communities that have been impacted by oil and gas, including a final one that was online. Next slide, please. And these are the communities that we chose to visit. The community meetings themselves varied from 20 to 25 people who participated. The virtual town hall meeting that we had 72 individuals participate. Sorry, that sounds very specific, but it stuck in my mind because we had so many. And for the virtual town hall, what we tried also to do something different, instead of allocating everybody 3 minutes because we have this many people and only 3 hours, what we said is there's a lot of you here today. We want everyone to have an opportunity to speak and share their lived experience, share their ideas. We're not going to put the clock on, but we hope that everyone will be respectful of the fact that there are many people waiting in line. And we managed to get through everybody in our 3-hour time allotment. So it was really nice. And I think people then didn't feel the pressure to unnecessarily limit themselves to 3 minutes, or in most cases got done before their 3 minute, the normal 3 minute limit that we have. Next slide, please. So we then gave a presentation, I did, and Commissioner Cross, because we kind of led up the community engagement piece, gave a presentation back to the commission and said, these are the themes we're hearing from community. They want us to define cumulative impacts, and they want us to update our definition for disproportionately impacted communities. They wanted us to improve the way we're evaluating and then addressing the impacts of oil and gas. Feedback from them was we're doing a good job, at collecting a lot of data about oil and gas, air emissions, location, other impacts surrounding, how many wells are being plugged at the same time. But we're not doing a good job at taking that information and assessing it in a way that gives us a landscape view of the cumulative impacts of oil and gas on communities, and then doing something different related to if we see a greater impact on some communities. So that also tied to a very strong theme from communities who said there are some communities that are disproportionately impacted related to oil and gas, and they are at their capacity. The bathtub is full, and something different has to happen if you're going to consider adding more permits or more growth in oil and gas in that type of community, and wanting us to define that. They were also very interested in making sure that we were collaborating better with our sister agencies, and in particular, the Department of Public Health and Environment, because obviously the main concern around oil and gas development is air emissions. And then making sure, kind of tied to the other themes here, that we're linking our decision-making to goals that have been set either by CDPHE or our commission itself, and our ability to review a permit and say, this isn't meeting a goal over at CDPHE, for example, so we would have to do something different, or we have to deny this permit. Next slide, please. So after all of that, we came up with what we call a red line document. That document, we gave everybody another bite at the apple and said, what do you think about this red line? This is what we heard you say. These are the changes we'd like to make. What do you think? And stakeholders had another opportunity to be in front of the commission and share with us parts that they thought were missing, we didn't quite get right, or they were happy to see. Then that draft got updated again and got submitted to the Secretary of State for formal rulemaking. But we are going to have 2 more oral public comment sessions about the formal official red line draft that was submitted to the Secretary of State's office. And we'll make yet 1 more change before we kick in our formal hearing process, where we have a very formal docket. People have party status. A lot of them are represented by lawyers, for example, and we're going to try to do another 2 more bites at the apple to give people another chance to give us feedback before we go there. Next slide. So the changes that we included in the draft rules, we did come up with definitions for cumulative impacts and updated our disproportionately impacted definition. Varying degrees of happiness with how the commission has put that together in the draft. We changed how community engagement happens in our permitting process, so that if something is going to be permitted or considered within a disproportionately impacted community, the operator is now required to invite community to a meeting with the relevant local government, the operator, and relevant state agencies to discuss where they're thinking of locating their operations and the potential impacts of those operations on community, so that community can give feedback earlier in a process before the permit actually gets submitted to the commission. We also created a community liaison position in our draft rules to try to improve the way that we engage with community and have, I guess, someone to help us boost the way that we do that work. And then we have linked our processes and outcomes, in particular around greenhouse gases and NOx emissions, with the goals that have been set over at the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. So, for example, individual operators have to meet greenhouse gas and NOx intensity goals. If they're not meeting those goals, the rules strongly suggest that you would not apply for a permit because you're not meeting your current goals with CDPHE. Next slide, please. Some things that still need work that we've heard from our partners. We haven't quite figured out how to define when a community is at its threshold, when it's had too much, and what different things need to happen then if an operator is applying to add additional emissions or land impacts to that community. And then I think they would also like to see us even more in our rules, be clear about this data that we're collecting. How are we going to use it in a feedback loop to change the way we review permits or make different decisions based on what we see from all the data that we gather from operators? Next slide, please. So some of the things that we tried also to do differently in our process for this rulemaking, The rule that was submitted to the Secretary of State's is now also included, has a Spanish version. What we heard from stakeholders is please don't just give us a PDF. We'd like to have the Word document so that we can work directly in it and show you the actual language that we'd like to change. So that is available to stakeholders. Again, we are providing informal written and oral opportunities for feedback before we kick into that formal semi-adjudicatory process. And we're allowing for more changes to happen before the commission has its formal hearing on those draft rules. I also think that perhaps our commission is a little more accessible than perhaps what I'm hearing from your presenters about PUC. Individual stakeholders are allowed to talk to commissioners about draft rules and rulemaking, especially before it gets into this formal adjudicatory process. Next slide, please. So lessons learned for us provide a long runway for those community meetings. It felt very rushed at the end. We had done all these other processes, the oral, the written, which were all online. Then we heard from community, we need you to come out and visit us. Unfortunately, our legislative deadline is April. And so the community meetings felt rushed. And I think we could have done a better job working with local nonprofits, working with folks who have connections in communities to get the people that we really wanted to hear from to our community meetings. I think a really important part of the process was representing what we heard from community back to the commission and making sure that we were reflecting it in our discussion when we were updating the rules and coming up with our draft rules so that people could see that we heard and we listened and then we tried to incorporate changes based on what we heard. I think another important lesson that we learned is, especially when you're working with people new to your process, people do not understand the process of rulemaking. It's very formalized. There are rules around rulemaking. I guess a specific example might be in the draft rules, we specifically reference Reg 7 and a specific date that it was passed over at CDPHE because APA rules do not allow you to have an evergreen reference to a rule. You have to pick a rule that was passed at a certain date and time. And if you want to update it because that rule got updated, you as a commission have to then update your own rules to refresh to that updated rule. So that's a very technical thing, but people were very confused why we had a very specific date to a rule that we reference at a sister agency. I think it's also super important to listen, listen, listen. You might not agree with what people are saying from community, but they want to share their lived experience with you. They want to tell you why they're frustrated, what is happening in their community related to the things that you are approving on a daily basis or are a part of your job. We had one community meeting where we had an individual who would argue with members who were sharing their experience or their ideas. And we really had to figure out, a polite way to try to tell this person, we're just here to listen and we're taking notes and we're going to bring it all together. And everyone's input is important, right? And then ask for feedback. Ask the communities that you're working with, how are we doing and how can we do better? And don't be afraid to make mistakes and don't be afraid to say, you're right. We kind of dropped the ball there. We're going to do better next time. It's an iterative process, right? Next slide, please. Oh, that's the end.
Thanks, Commissioner McGowan. Really appreciate your insights here in the game in Colorado as well. So very, very helpful to hear. And I hope you'll be able to stick around after our next presenter where we do Q&A. And we are very nearly on time now. I got our break out of the program. So thank you very much for your presentation. And I do have some questions for you if you stick around after our final presenter here. So thank you very much. I'd now like to welcome our next speaker, Michelle Scala with the Oregon PUC. Michelle comes from a background in economics, public policy, and social equity. She has applied her degrees and certifications in economics, political science, and public administration throughout various roles as a policy advisor, analyst, and economist in state government for over a decade. She joined the Oregon PUC in 2020, where she currently serves as the agency's Energy Justice Program Manager, leading the utility staff on incorporating social equity and environmental justice into their analysis across regulatory proceedings and policy implementation. So, so wonderful to have you, Michelle, and really look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Should I share?
Michelle, can you try and speak again? I have you really quiet. Maybe just try and say something.
Is that better?
That is better to me.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Okay.
Do I need to share, or is it available on your end?
I think Miss Chula can do it. We'll probably see it pop up in just a second if she can do it.
Okay, great. Well, while it comes up,
I'm no longer at her desk because I got my own internet.
That's awesome. Well, I'll just say it's kind of bittersweet to go last because there have been so many great and overlapping points from the previous speakers. And so in the interest of time, I'll try to go light on areas where folks have done a really great job addressing similar learnings out of Oregon's experiences. But
Michelle, this is Jessie. I do not think I have your slides.
okay, well, I can pull it up. I sent it like last minute, so
Oh shoot. Okay.
my bad. Let me see
You should have screen share ability if you want to do it. Otherwise, I think Ms. Chula can do a last minute check of the email.
How does the reading view? Does that look pretty good on your guys' end? Can you see that?
I don't have anything yet.
Okay. What about now?
It's coming. Yep, we got it.
Okay, yay.
Awesome. Thank you.
Did it still work or did it go to my other screen?
We're seeing it in presentation mode, so it looks good.
Great. Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. Okay, well, thank you for inviting me. Yeah, as Megan noted, my name is Michelle Scala, and I'm at the Oregon Public Utility Commission. The way that I tried to structure this presentation, it doesn't go into the details in the written text, but I will note that Oregon is doing actively a lot of these things that I kind of highlight more as like almost like talking points. And so to the extent that there's questions about specifics, I'm hoping that this kind of buckets the different areas where we're doing work and applying principles and tenets of equity that can create additional dialogue after this. So this page here, we're just kind of highlighting the different things that we've done in terms of community engagement, again, from just kind of a talking point perspective. And then I'll go into more detail on the three bullets at the end there, the implementing equity, focus on affordability and procedural justice. But my structural support slide disappeared, and so I'll just talk about that here. And so, some of the things that we point out in terms of structural support, if you think about structural justice, it's kind of understanding what's the lay of the land and what do we have to address in terms of like system inequities that are kind of built in based on business as usual. And so one of the big things that, I think brings us here today is the idea of having legislation to support intentional equity work at the commission. And so, we had several bills pass through that went into effect in 2021 that allowed us the space to consider differential energy burdens in both rate design programs and more. And that really is a very broad authority docket that created space for us to kind of go in and say, well, this can be a different carve out for certain communities because they face these kind of historic inequities. We also had the clean energy legislation that specifically highlighted the need to center environmental justice communities in planning so that we could achieve a just transition. And it called out things like community benefits indicators and community-based renewable energy projects to make sure that we were kind of advancing folks in communities that have historically been left behind. And so these kind of laws, they don't just apply to us as a regulatory body, but they also extend some ownership to the utilities, which was a really important piece of having that structural support via legislation, because as a regulatory body, there are going to be certain areas where authority simply does not reach, and you need to have that kind of statutory backing in order to get action to take place in, regulating a for-profit entity, to be perfectly candid. And we're even identifying areas now where we still might need to fill some gaps with additional legislation that we can achieve through working with our director on policy and her contacts at the legislature. Another piece of that structural support element is kind of adopting equity language into your own agency mission, vision, and value statement. And so there's been so many different interpretations of this idea of like just and reasonable rates, right? And historically, we've been economic regulators. And so when you look across your staff, you have these highly technical experts in engineering and economics. And when you look at your precedent, a lot of times the orders are based on this kind of less heterogeneous analysis of residential communities and ratepayers. And in order to introduce that, you kind of need to build that into your goal as an agency so that there's not this reluctance from kind of like a agency mission statement perspective. And so that's been important to us. Inclusive language and defining environmental justice and social equity objectives is another big piece. I've heard a lot of people talking about how do you define community and how do we kind of set those thresholds? And I think one of the big learnings that Oregon has had is it's best to put something on paper, but to be inclusive. And so if there are communities that want to come in and identify themselves as, environmental justice communities, which have, the ability to access certain programs or funding, then, the idea should be to understand what these communities' needs are rather than to set thresholds beforehand. And so we found rather than getting overly prescriptive with definitions, we've called some out and made that kind of including but not limited to language so that we can have the dialogue when appropriate. Additionally, we've also gone into our administrative rules to a limited extent. That journey continues today, but where we could identify opportunities to create additional protections for certain environmental justice communities where we've seen existing rules create, or exacerbate disparities between, environmental justice community versus non-environmental justice community. So this, for example, happened in our Division 21 customer protections rulemaking, where we built in like fee-free reconnection or additional disconnection protections during climate events that were a little bit bigger for environmental justice communities or vulnerable communities. And there was a lot of low barrier identification built in by creating like self-attestation for these communities in certain situations. And then lastly, I'll just kind of mention the idea of dedicated resources through equity-focused staff like myself and our DEI director. Now, I think that we're learning over time just how big this work is, and that, a party of two might not be enough to be in all of the different spaces you need to be in at a time. But at the same time, even just starting with the two of us, it creates, space to build out an equity framework like I hear you're trying to do at the Colorado Public Utility Commission, and then kind of cultivate an agency culture where folks are going into dockets, regardless of whether I'm directly overseeing it, and taking an equity lens to it, asking the right questions, engaging with the right communities, and then performing the necessary outreach either directly or through the utilities and other stakeholders that they partner with. And then one thing that's not called out here, but I did hear mentioned in the previous presentations, was the idea of state partners. And that can be from the community or state agencies. We are working on additional data analysis, mapping tools, and equity metrics, and all of those different things. But we do have mapping tools available through our Oregon Housing and Community Services Agency. We have accessible and functional needs populations data through our Department of Human Services. And then, of course, if we ever got to this point, we could get tax data from our Department of Revenue in order to kind of identify more income eligible households and encourage auto enrollment in certain programs. I mean, these are all things that are actively happening and are on the horizon or still very nascent, but we're just trying to understand how to leverage the work that other people in the state are doing, whether they're community or public, and use that to advance not only more streamlined engagement on our dockets, but also achieve some kind of near-term results with that low-hanging fruit. And so since I've already taken up enough time on this slide, I'm going to go over the other three on the next one. So if you could please, I guess I'm the one advancing the slides. There we go. Okay, so for the next piece, implementing equity in utility planning and investment strategies. So as I mentioned earlier, some of the big dockets that we're working with now, where a lot of these lessons come from, are our Energy Affordability Act implementation docket, which is a multi-phase effort where initially we did near-term action via interim bill discount programs, and now we're moving towards a more robust investigative process where we're doing multiple work streams that address data needs, program needs, and rate needs. But having the interim action in place has allowed us the space to say that we are doing things actively to address affordability and give us the space to kind of do the more deeper dive into it. Another one is integrated resource plans, which are now coupled with clean energy plans that were mandated through House Bill 2021. And both of those processes have very robust requirements when it comes to community engagement plans, community benefits indicators, and again, like I mentioned earlier, community-based renewable energy projects. And we've also gotten to encourage stakeholders from environmental justice communities to be a much more active participant in all of these proceedings, because we included environmental justice intervener funding as part of our early implementation efforts for the Energy Affordability Act. And that creates dedicated funding for folks to intervene. And it's not a formal intervention, or I guess it is formal, but it's not as formal as previously, because our chief ALJ worked very closely with communities on how to develop an accessible application and understand how you didn't need to be docket specific to access these funds. So they could say, I care about affordability, and any docket that we identify as being tangential to affordability could be included in their application for intervener funding. And then the other ones that I didn't mention, and I won't go into too much detail about, include our transportation electrification plans, our distribution system planning, and our partnership with Energy Trust of Oregon that administers some of our electric utility energy efficiency programs, and several others. But in terms of this slide, I just wanted to highlight on the left-hand side, those colored boxes where there's kind of a step-by-step process that really encourages meaningful community engagement in these different spaces that can follow all of them because they're broad enough to kind of be adapted as needed. But you need to identify and connect with impacted communities early. And that is going to give you the landscape that you need to understand, like, what the priorities of that community are. What are the needs? How does the information need to be presented in order for them to engage meaningfully? And the onus should really be on someone other than the communities to connect. And it also shouldn't just be placed on environmental justice advocates that are familiar with the process. While you can utilize those partnerships to reach community, it shouldn't be that you expect them to bring them to you. You can utilize the utilities capacity to do so. A lot of times they're developing dedicated resources to outreach and engagement, but it needs to be very intentional, and it also should be sensitive to the community needs, because a lot of times there is, someone else highlighted this tension between working in these processes, not only because of a distrust in government, a distrust in utilities, but also how inaccessible these proceedings can be even when you're here at the table. So collaborating with stakeholders on how to make the process more equitable and accessible and ensure diverse representation, and then framing the decision-making and the input and collaboration based on priorities is a really important piece. So you should be very clear about where along the spectrum of engagement you plan to work with the community. Because if your intention is to only allow them to inform, then are you really asking them to collaborate with you, or are they expecting collaboration when really you're just getting validation on some foregone conclusion? And so there is lots of literature on spectrum of engagement. There's different iterations of the table. And so being open about like where the community can weigh in along that can really help them to find the time to meaningfully engage, not only in the beginning, but in future proceedings as well, because they can appreciate that transparency. Some folks have asked a lot about metrics and measures of effectiveness. And I think that there are some like near-term grabs that you can do in terms of like how effective are we being, like someone mentioned participation rates, you know, the diversity of the groups present. But I think the most important piece to understanding whether you're meaningfully engaging the public is to ask the public directly. Do they feel their input was applied? And can the utility or whatever entity you're working with specifically point to the places in their proposal that incorporates that community input? And then one way to kind of create and drive accountability there, you know, the previous commissioner who spoke did a great job of going through the importance of feedback loops. So I won't go in that too much, but it provides an opportunity to not only monitor and engage, but also it creates and cultivates trust between the stakeholders because they can see things that were and were not adopted and understand why for both as well, which is something that we hear quite frequently in these groups. So I'm going to go to the next slide here. So this is my one fun slide. So the big elephant in the room is affordability. And so what a lot of times we'll hear when we're talking with other commissions and the utilities and amongst ourselves is a challenge in getting meaningful input on technical concepts and dockets is this idea that you're constantly just hearing, well, our bills are too high. And even in like public meetings, like sometimes when there's that open period for comment on items not docketed, it's like, we can't afford our bills. And I mean, we have to be, you know, honest and empathetic to this situation, even if you're not a particularly energy burdened household yourself, because as someone previously presenting mentioned, you know, if folks can't meet their basic needs, they're going to be, you know, less able, willing, I don't know, whichever emotion you want to identify, to kind of talk about more like technical concepts, like, you know, do you think that we should invest in this resource versus that resource? And so knowing that frontline communities identify affordability as the biggest challenge they face and that this is crucial to basic needs, health and safety, it's important that your equity work focuses on that alongside anything else that's happening. Because if customers can't afford to reach their bills, it's almost like it's tone deaf to be asking them to spend additional time and resource providing input so that we can meet compliance requirements on equity legislation and the utility can check their box. And it all becomes very performative and you'll quickly lose the audience. So just in terms of how we've been addressing affordability issues, we've been doing a combination of internal work and external work, as well as near-term and long-term efforts. So some of the external work that we've done with the utilities is calling for energy burden assessments. This is sometimes referred to as the low-income needs assessment, but because our legislation encompasses more than just income qualified homes, and it actually goes into other socioeconomic characteristics, we want to recognize that there are intersectional features and characteristics that contribute to energy burden. And so this has given us the space to see more granular analysis. And of course, there's always going to be some weaknesses in the data. Credit data is going to exclude people that don't have access to credit. And a lot of these energy burden assessment organizations do kind of interpolation of households. And so if you've got a lot of income diversity in a very dense area, it's not going to be the best, but I can tell you this, it's better than nothing, right? It's better than just using LIHEAP data, which has, you know, notoriously low participation rates. So getting something that's very dedicated and you can fund it through the utility via rates if you need to, but getting that assessment, getting something on the books, and in the interest of what Tara had highlighted, you know, possibly getting it to be a publicly facing product is a very valuable resource because then it also informs potential engagement. We've also done the customer protections that I mentioned earlier. Differential rates and percentage-based bill discounts are two big things that we're doing in both the near and long term. So right now, the low-hanging fruit for affordability mechanisms was a percentage of bill-based discount, and it was done with a tiered system. It's not standardized across the utilities because not only are there different community needs, but there's also different cost recovery capacities. We have some utilities that have a very small service territory with a homogeneous income based skewed left of center. And so they're going to have a harder time funding a really, really robust program. But what can we do instead? We have to ask and explore. We're doing an investigation into differential rate designs and what level of standardization is appropriate, but that's all in development now. And part of what's informing that process was issuing a survey to stakeholders that they could extend to community members to help us scope what the high priorities for differential rates and affordability dockets would be in the upcoming process. And then again, targeted demand side management. You know, discounting bills will only go so far. We need to address usage, especially in a time of electrification. And we need to think about building stock and how usage might be driven more by the energy efficiency of the home than someone being an imprudent user. So are seasonal rates appropriate when you're implementing price signals to people that don't have a flexible load? Things like that to consider. And so I've already kind of highlighted things about what's next, but just it's so important to fully integrate affordability into the process. It can't just be a carve out for low income because at the end of the day, rate pressure is growing. And at some point, without addressing affordability broadly as an economic regulator, you're just going to have 5% of the population in the standard service schedule and everybody else in the low income category. Also addressing weaknesses in the availability of EJ metrics. A lot of times I'll hear dialogue, both internal and external, about how difficult it is to apply EJ in economic analysis and utility planning because the data is not available, but that can't be an excuse. We can come up with proxy work, we can work with the national labs, and we can figure something out, even if it's something as simple as like a decrement, right? Like what they did with energy efficiency originally, the 10% to make it better. Just something needs to be done. And then we're also doing an internal investigation of rate pressures to understand how we can help things internally. I think I'm talking way too much, so I'm going to go a little bit faster here. Procedural justice, a lot of folks have already targeted this, but again, I mentioned the intervenor funding. Creative and novel processes is something I think we heard a lot about today, and I encourage it so much. Finding ways to build in accessible process via the needs of the community. And so maybe, you know, a super litigious environment is not conducive with community engagement. Is that something that you need to address at the rule level, at the legislative level? Like, what inward reflection can we do? Because I discourage silos tremendously, because as long as you silo it between technical and community, then the technical folks are going to deprioritize community. And there's always going to be the game of telephone in terms of bringing the community perspectives into the technical space. Educational opportunities is big. How do you make the information, you know, useful to the community? Well, the way that we've been trying to do things is to come from the impacts and then walk backwards. The way that communities can most likely weigh in some of our spaces is if we explain how certain decisions are going to impact them at home and their energy security. And then we can walk backwards through the different pathways, and then it's easier to kind of select how this decision tree works for them as a community, as a household, as an individual. And then advisory groups. This is something that's very interesting and very difficult to do, but I've seen lots of different forms. You can have community advisory groups that have a lot of collaboration and trust internally. You can have utility run advisory groups where sometimes you're vulnerable to a captive audience watching a utility commercial on repeat, and you can try to do it as the agency, but you're always going to be strapped for resources and worried about if you're doing it right and if there's someone who could do it better. So this next page just goes into a little bit of what we've been testing out with equity advisory groups. We're making sure that they're representative of the impacted communities by having minimum identities represented in their membership. And then the utility has to explain a lot if they're not able to get all of those minimum representations. It does help to provide a community lens across the processes because it creates an open dialogue to forum, and we create these kind of safe spaces to just have a very organic conversation about the issues. And then another big part of what we're doing is to require a biennial report that's actually developed by the utility, but informed by the advisory group. And it's supposed to highlight how the group informed these kind of high impact areas of equity in the energy system. So energy burden, how they're contracting resiliency and grid investments. Just briefly, since you have the slides, this is just some of the perspectives that we heard from advocates and staff on how community engagement has been going so far and where they think the wins and maybe challenges are. So the importance of transparency, accountability, and accessibility. How are things being used? You know, some people say, make sure you have an agenda. The previous commissioner mentioned the long runway. I double down on that because a lot of times a 2-week comment period isn't enough if environmental justice communities are trying to build coalitions with community. So create space for it and then balance the near-term expedition with the long-term sophistication. Sorry, this last slide is just opportunities and observations. So just to kind of summarize, I think it's very important to be intentional and accountable. So not only are you making the work happen, but you're also willing to own up to mistakes. You're willing to provide the information folks need to understand if their input is being heard. I think that in terms of moving towards meaningful engagement and substantive topics, it's so important to contextualize the material for the audience. Someone mentioned the open house forum. I also agree with that. I think it's important to make sure that you're not just holding an audience captive for an extended amount of time. And then at the end of your very technical presentation saying, so what do you think? So, you know, considering how would this information be presented if it wasn't a technical topic? And is there space for you to adjust your materials to do just that? Avoid a framing bias, captive audience, and filibusters. Someone mentioned earlier that there are people that can take up a lot of space in the room. And so sometimes operating agreements can help that. They can seem performative if you use formulaic language every time. I've heard land acknowledgements have mixed reviews, and I've heard the operating agreements have mixed reviews. So ask your community, what is an impactful way to kind of control the space, to scope the dialogue, and to acknowledge historic harms in a way that won't come off as performative and then discourage meaningful engagement. And then lastly, I'll just say ensuring community engagement is additive rather than substituted for an existing environmental justice advocacy. We have a lot of great advocates engaging on environmental justice issues. And so sometimes when we put these community engagement like requirements in place, we're noticing that there's a little bit of like tomfoolery happening with the utilities where, and I'm not saying it's intentional, but where they'll position the community feedback that perhaps wasn't sufficiently informed and was more of a validation exercise as being the, you know, weightier factor than environmental justice advocates. And it's a challenge because you know that the environmental justice advocates might be more informed about certain processes, and why weren't their perspectives brought into the community engagement if the utility was the one doing the outreach. So just kind of keeping an eye out for those potential weaknesses in the strategy and how prescriptive you get with your community engagement goals. And I'm sorry if I went over. I'll just stop there. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you so much for your presentation, Michelle. Really appreciate your perspective and all the great work you're doing in Oregon. So if our presenters are still with us, can turn on your cameras if you're able. Just, I have a question. I don't know, Commissioner Plant, if you'll have any questions or if the chair has any questions. So go ahead, Chair Blank, you can get us started.
Yeah, I guess I got a gnarly question for Grace from Hawaii. I was just really struck by your 40 cents per kilowatt hour rates and your land constraints, where the only open land is in native communities. And it's something we struggled with last year, and you know, sort of what Michelle talked about when gas prices spiked and people were just mad and we had nothing to do to really solve the problem. And you know, I guess I struggle with it on the gas side too, right? Where our environmental requirements, you know, are going to reduce throughput, and we still have all these safety investments. So I guess the question is are there just limits to how much we can solve with procedural and, you know, stakeholder and process equity? You know, I was listening to what you were talking about in Hawaii, and I was just struck, like, holy moly, how do you solve this with process or stakeholder input or better websites? I mean, it's like an intractable environment, you know, economic problem. And, you know, we saw that last year. Fortunately, gas prices came down, and I'm worried we're facing something similar on the gas side. So just wanted to add that one question to your list and see if you struggle with that and what you do with that.
Oh, yes, absolutely. We struggle with that. It's a huge, huge challenge here. You know, every day we think about the price of electricity here. It's just enormous. It's so impactful to our communities and families here, and it's a life-sustaining service. So think about that all the time. I totally agree that I think the problem with energy prices is much bigger than procedural equity. And it has to be, I don't know, a driving factor in every decision made at the commission. And I'll just mention some of the ways I think that we're kind of thinking about that beyond this equity docket, which is just really a faster transition to renewable energy, because we are so reliant on imported oil here that we're really at the mercy of those global oil markets. And that makes up about half of customer bills here. So we're trying to get away from that as quickly as possible. But where that intersects with our equity docket and this participation piece of things is that we know we need, 80 or so projects to come online in the next 10, 15 years to meet our renewable energy goals. That's a huge number of projects, and we have to figure out where they're going. So in my mind, I think of our equity docket and the community engagement piece as risk reduction to getting those projects online. If you can get communities on board early, you reduce the risk of lawsuits down the line or protests or things we've seen in Hawaii to major wind farms and other projects. So I'm trying to think of this as like risk mitigation to those measures that will help us bring down the cost of energy. So yeah, that's just one thought. We also have our performance-based regulation framework for Hawaiian Electric that does try to incentivize cost control as well overall and lead their decision-making to improve affordability.
I appreciate it, Michelle.
Well, thanks. I just wanted to chime in just because I'm actually from Hawaii and I, lived on Oahu for most of my life. And I think that this is also a good space to kind of, evaluate your authority as a commission. And like, I think you were alluding to, Commissioner, where you can't solve the problem and maybe which resources and which entities are best poised to do that. Hawaii has a very profound wealth gap, and it's definitely biased against the Native, Indigenous, and BIPOC community out there. And so to that end, and the fact that the housing stock is also very disproportionately allocated as far as efficiency and rooftop solar, I think that this might be a space where the PUC can do a lot of things that will be, very meaningful. But when it comes to addressing affordability concerns for certain populations, and we're facing the same thing in Oregon, that you're going to need another entity, another agency, and another funding source to get at that problem.
I appreciate it. Just we've just gotten beat up in certain situations where there's just nothing we can do. Back to you, Commissioner Gilman.
Thank you. And very unfortunately, we will have to wrap up a couple minutes after 5. But Commissioner Plant wanted to give you a minute if you have a question you want to ask.
I do. Thank you. I know that we're limited in time, but I just real quickly, I'm just interested if your PUCs in your various states have been engaged in sort of partnering or becoming integrated with other service outreach components within the state governments or local governments even. So we've got in Colorado most of our mental health, senior services, things are operating through county through our the county offices within those communities. And I'm reminded about in mental health, there's this sort of concept of wraparound care where you try and identify all the various different components that can contribute to somebody's mental well-being. And I wonder if there's any kind of efforts in any of your states to try and do that same kind of wraparound care that would integrate energy and energy costs and energy services and various different, weatherization, whatever it might be, with those other social services that are being offered through the state.
Don't be shy. Yeah, Michelle.
Yeah, well, I don't want to take up space. It looked like Tara was about to talk. Really quickly, I'll say yes, I think so. We have the ODO, the Oregon Department of Energy, and they're still in the middle of developing their state energy plan. But one of the things that's happening there is partnering with other state agencies that kind of offer one-stop shop services so that we can utilize things like categorical eligibility and categorical enrollment in certain programs. Additionally, I serve as the Environmental Justice Council liaison. And so the Environmental Justice Council task force, or that was what it was previously called, they were called to action in HB 4077. And it's a compilation, and natural resource agencies are required to engage with this council, and that gives us an opportunity to bring things before this council in the presence of other natural resource agencies as well, and get feedback on different ideas that kind of intersect with these groups, and also get additional guidance that they can lift up to the legislature if we need action there. We also submit Environmental Justice Council reports annually to this group, and it has been very interesting and informative for us so far, but it's still also kind of brand new, so we're still getting learnings from that.
Go ahead, Tara.
I wasn't sure if oh, thank you so much. Thanks, commissioners, and thanks, Michelle. And I think that in Minnesota, we're right now taking a look at auto. Just got home from daycare. We're taking a look at auto enroll required to have gas affordability plans that are separate affordability services to something like energy assistance, and they're required to use energy assistance to auto enroll folks in their own specific utility programs. And we're trying now to consider, what if we could just use something like food assistance, our SNAP program, something like that, to say, if you have this, we know you're income qualified, let's just auto enroll you in every type of energy and service we have. And I know you were speaking time again that the application process is you want to find.
Great, thanks a lot. I appreciate it. It's a huge lift, I think, but a really great thing if we can accomplish it. Yeah.
So I have a follow-up question for most of you. It'll be like lightning round, but I keep trying to sort out, what amount of community outreach and kind of proactive information sharing and pushing out information about important proceedings will or should fall on the commission and our staff versus on the utility or other stakeholders, or kind of how we figure out that breakdown. So I'm curious to some extent how you all figured out or arrived at the point you're at to say, well, we should do this and perhaps the utility or someone else should do this outreach. And I think that is, as bureaucratic as it sounds, to me, very much tied to the resources that we have internally, for us. So kind of as part of that question, I'm also curious to understand from each of your organizations, how big is your staff that does, kind of community relations and outreach or equity work at large, so I can get kind of a reference for our work. So those questions tied together, because very unfortunately, they're tied together. We can do what we have the staffing to do. Otherwise, we're going to execute it really, really poorly. So anybody wants to start, that would be great.
Yeah, I can start, but I don't know how much of value we have to add to your considerations there, because we're going out of house for this. We have one communications officer. Our PUC in total is about 55 people. We have one communications officer, one kind of outreach coordinator, and then our research staff is, 12 people. So we're small. And we really, I think, have recognized that we just don't have the in-house expertise on communications, outreach, coordination. So that is why we're going out to bid for a local consultant to help us with this. Yeah, and to the point about just kind of coordinating, I think we are thinking of that as an opportunity to leverage outside resources. When the utility is already planning to go out to a community event or be in contact with people, same with the state energy office or other key stakeholders, can we leverage that to get information out about our equity proceeding, or can we join them? It's definitely still an area of growth, but I think just kind of leveraging those partnerships will help us build resources that we don't necessarily have at our disposal right now.
Thank you for that reference. Commissioner McGowan.
So I guess my answer is it's both, and it's all of the above. And in some businesses, we require operators to do things when they're going to be in community. They need to share certain information ahead of time. They need to prove or show to us that they've done a certain amount of outreach, that they've had community meetings and community engagement. If English as a second language hits a certain threshold, they have to show us that they provided information in the language that is spoken in that community, all of those things. That being said, I think that there are things that happen in front of our commission that are beyond just one community, and it's our job to make sure that we're including as many people as possible because they care about, so like for our cumulative impacts rulemaking, it was on us to get out there, and we're all full-time commissioners, and I said, I will do 5 community meetings. I'll get out there and do it. I want to create those relationships. I want to know that I'm a person that people can call and talk to. And so I think for us, it's been an all hands on deck. We have one communications person. Her hands are, very full and busy. And I think it's hard. Equity work is hard work. And we all have to put in as much as we can in order for it to be successful. And I guess my other comment would be, I think it's also beholden on us when the legislature asks us to do things that we start fiscal noting things and saying, I don't know if you all call it fiscal noting in your other states. If you want me to do this well, I need these kinds of resources in order to reach out to these kinds of communities to make it meaningful. And we've been having discussions as a commission about starting to fiscal note things so that we can have meaningful engagement when we're asked to update things, change things, do something new.
Other
I will
perspectives?
say,
Yeah.
sorry, to cut you off, Commissioner Gilman. I would say in Minnesota, we also kind of perceive it as a collaborative approach. I think the commission does a lot of the public outreach in concert with the utility. We also have a community affairs office who can do things like help the utilities create a script for their customer service representatives. And we have the purview to review that script and make sure that it's getting in the right information. And we also, I think, are intentional and purposeful about kind of meeting stakeholders where they're at in the community. And that's one of the reasons that we've created this database of public meeting venues so that we can help the utilities kind of get on the same page with us for holding these meetings within the community in places that are accessible to the community.
I'll just echo what sorry, Commissioner. I'll just echo what others had said as well. But I think that there's a kind of a phased approach to it. I think right now with where we're at, it sounds like a lot of us are pretty limited with our resources. I like this idea of fiscal noting. I think we're doing something a little bit less formalized, but I think it's great because resources are needed. So we also only have one communications officer currently. And then as I mentioned earlier, it's an equity staff of 2. And, a lot of times my expertise tends to lean towards the technical. Fortunately, I have lived experiences as well, which allows me some, capacity in this space. And I think, to be perfectly candid, sometimes certain communities want to talk to people that look like me versus some of the traditional people you see in the energy industry space. And I think that we shouldn't be too sensitive to that reality because that's going to be one of the ways that we can get into the spaces. But I also think that if you are able and in a space to get additional resources to engage as the agency, there is an appetite for it in the community. I think there's more trust with the commission than there is with the utilities currently. And so while it is very essential that the utilities are responsible for their community engagement so that it's part of their agency culture as well, I think that I would be very interested in having more public facing, materials, more presence on social media, more, how to YouTube things that I see some of the other commissions doing. I think if you do a quick scan of Public Utility Commission websites, you can see who has more funds than others. And I think it really does make a very visible difference. So, check out Minnesota. I don't know how many resources they have, but their website looks great. And I think I've heard Chair Christian talk about a lot of the things that they have as well. So resources are key. But everyone should have skin in the game, I think, when it comes to successful engagement.
I hope we're not being judged too bad by our website because we're having a lot more fun than that website will show.
But let the record show that Michelle has been to the Minnesota website and that it's a very good PUC website, which is like accolades you do not get every day. So I would take that one, ladies. With
I'm gonna
that,
have to jump off, Megan. So just thanks to everybody for a great afternoon and a really engaging, informative dialogue. I learned a ton and greatly appreciate it. So thanks all.
I think everybody's just about got to hop off. So I did want to just officially thank all of you, our speakers, as well as Chair Christian and Berenice, who already had to leave us. But thank you all so much for sharing your experience. And I'm sure we will be in contact in the future. Just a lot to share and learn with all of you, and really appreciate the work you all are doing and your ability and your willingness to take time out of your day to help share some of it with us, to help us improve on our process here. So thank you all so much. And of course, very sincere thank you to Ms. Chula, Ms. Crandall internally here. Thank you for your cubicle. Thank you for your work in getting this all together. Just a fantastic panel of speakers, and I learned a lot. So thank you all so much, and I hope you enjoy your evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.